If we can begin the hearing, there are going to be votes around 11:30 or so we want to kind of move along if we can. I want to thank all of you for joining us at this morning's hearing on the plight of prisoners of conscience worldwide, with a specific focus on how the U.S. government can more effectively, and not only the government, all of us as individuals, advocate for those whose voices have been silenced. I want to offer a special word of thanks to our distinguished witnesses, many of whom have traveled great distances at their own expense to be here today and to tell their story, and in some cases, the stories of their loved ones who unjustly languish in prison. In December 2012, the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, in conjunction with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and Amnesty International USA, launched the Defending Freedoms Project with the aim of supporting human rights and religious freedom throughout the world, with a particular focus on prisoners of conscience. This initiative involves members of Congress adopting prisoners and committing to advocating on their behalf. I was pleased to adopt Chinese dissident Gao Xingsheng, who has suffered greatly at the hands of his own government solely for proclaiming his Christian faith and defending other marginalized and persecuted people in China. We will soon hear testimony from his wife, who has committed herself to ensuring that her husband is not forgotten. In October, I wrote Secretary Kerry and urged him to meet with Gao's wife. This was my second request in 8 months. In both instances, this simple request fell on deaf ears. To date, Secretary Kerry has not agreed to meet with her. With history as our guide, we know that such meetings, symbolic as they may be, send powerful messages to a watching world and can often be the catalyst for better treatment in prison and even freedom. I think this point will become clear as today's hearings unfold. In Gang Hal's devotion to her husband's cause, I am reminded of Soviet dissident Natan Sharansky's wife, Avital, who famously left no stone unturned in her campaign to secure his freedom. President Reagan's Secretary of State, George Shultz, once said, and I quote, "If the cause is right, never give up. Never give up." We didn't give up, and thankfully, neither did Avital. A rallying cry, if ever there was one, for those committed to securing basic human rights, including religious freedom for repressed people, wherever they may be. I venture that Mr. Sharansky would share this sentiment, and I'm honored that he has taken the time to join us today. I was first elected to Congress in 1980 on President Ronald Reagan's coattails, and have long sought to model his approach to human rights advocacy, especially with regard to the Soviet Union. Even at the height of the Cold War, when there were a host of bilateral issues on the agenda with Russia, Reagan consistently and publicly raised human rights concerns, along with people like Scoop Jackson and others, not simply in a generic terms. Rather, he raised and they raised specific cases, individual cases, advocating for the release of people by name. Among those people was Natan Sharansky. In 1989, Congressman Chris Smith, my good friend, and I visited Perm Camp 35, where Mr. Sharansky had spent nearly a decade. We took video footage of his cell. It was brutal. Brutal. It's in the middle of the Ural Mountains. He may mention it today. There is a torture chamber called the Shizo. I asked Mr. Sharansky if he had been in the Shizo, and he said he spent almost 3 years in the Shizo. We returned, Chris and I, and sought to remind our own foreign policy establishment that political prisoners were not simply a relic of the past. The Iron Curtain may have fallen, but that message still has resonance today. While political prisoners and prisoners of conscience are still very much a reality, too often their stories are not known. Their cases are rarely highlighted in high-level diplomatic talks, and ultimately little progress is made in pursuit of their release and eventual freedom. The need for clear-eyed, committed advocacy, which speaks truth to power, must be a central element of U.S. foreign policy, whether it be a Republican administration or a Democratic administration. The same way as I look out and see Tom Lantos' daughter, the same way that Tom Lantos did. If you ever travel with Tom Lantos, anywhere around the world, always speaking truth to power. In a Constitution Day speech, President Ronald Reagan famously described the United States Constitution as, quote, a covenant we have made not only with ourselves, but with all of mankind. Not simply a covenant with those gathered on the hot summer day in Philadelphia in 1787, but a covenant with the students, protesters, and Tiananmen, with imprisoned people in Vietnam, labor activists, and with imperiled Coptic Christians. We have an obligation to keep that covenant. Where political leaders falter, those who care deeply about these most cherished national values must appeal then directly to the American people. If the political process doesn't do it, then the American people have to be motivated enough to motivate this institution and government. For there is a powerful case to be made, and I think we will find a reservoir of goodwill. In August 25, 1989, New York Times piece by late A.M. Rosenthal, profiling Natan Sharansky among other Soviet refuseniks, wrote the following. He said, quote, many Americans have shown they care, and it has helped bring down the number of prisoners. In many respects, the movement that coalesced around Soviet Jewry is a remarkable historic phenomenon and one worthy of our consideration, as there are undoubtedly lessons to be learned for today. America must once again show that we care about the gung-hoos of the world, like the Avatars before her, that they can be reunited with the ones they love, secure in the knowledge that the persecution has ended. So I appreciate, the witnesses coming from so far in these. With that, I'll turn to the Jim McGovern, the ranking member or the co-chairman of this committee.
Well, thank you very much, and I want to wish everybody a good morning and welcome everybody to this hearing on Defending Freedom's Project, highlighting the plight of prisoners of conscience around the world. I want to thank the staff of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for organizing this hearing. I want to especially thank my co-chair, Frank Wolf, for his leadership on this hearing. And this is the first hearing that we have had since Frank announced that he was not going to run for re-election. And I told him on the way over here that I'm sad about that. I'm a Democrat, and I'm supposed to want Democrats to win all the elections, but I will tell you, if I lived in Northern Virginia, I'd be proud to cast a vote for Frank Wolf. He's a man very much like Tom Lantos, who's guided by principle and whose unwavering voice on human rights is appreciated all around the world by those who are oppressed. So I wanted to make that public statement about my friend Frank Wolf. I also want to extend a very special welcome to all the panelists today. Thank you for your courage and for your advocacy on behalf of prisoners of conscience and for your tireless efforts to highlight their plight. I would like to specifically acknowledge the presence of Natan Sharansky, a prominent defender of human rights for Soviet Jewry, who has experienced, as Frank mentioned, the cruelty of the Soviet state-led opposition firsthand. And further, I know that in this audience today we have several relatives of currently imprisoned activists from all around the world. They came here hoping to hear us state our commitment to help them fight for the release of their loved ones. I thank you for your presence here today, for your courage and resolve to see your family members freed. We could not have chosen a better topic for the first Commission hearing of 2014. In every nation or region facing violations of human rights, behind every issue the Commission has sought to highlight over the years stand individuals who risk their lives and freedom to fight for truth, justice, and transparency in their countries, for freedom and equality for all, for simple human dignity. They dare to stand up to brutal regimes that do not tolerate dissent and often pay a heavy price for their work to promote and defend human rights. These individuals go to great lengths to have their voices heard, and it is very important that they are not forgotten behind the bars of oppression, that they are not left to suffer alone for the sacrifices that they had made for many. Today, we are just able to highlight a few of these cases in the ocean of many, just as they were and are untiring in their work. So we should be now in our advocacy on their behalf and our efforts for their release. Those in the world who prefer silence should hear our united voices loud and clear. So today, like many times before, I raise my voice on behalf of Nabil Rajab, a prominent Bahraini human rights activist who is currently serving 2 years in jail simply for engaging in nonviolent political protest. As I've repeatedly indicated since his conviction, it is my belief that the charges against him were politically motivated to thwart Mr. Rajab's nonviolent advocacy for political reform in Bahrain, and that his conviction has violated his internationally recognized right to freedom of expression and assembly. Nabil provides a critical voice to those working peacefully for democracy and respect for human rights and the rule of law in Bahrain. Releasing him would send an important signal that the Bahrain government is serious about political stability and reform. Therefore, I strongly urge the government of Bahrain to unconditionally release Nabil and to cease further threats against all nonviolent human rights activists and leaders of Bahrain's peaceful opposition. You know, the U.S. Congress has a long history of standing up for the disenfranchised and abused. It stood on the side of immigrants and championed the rights of those whose governments forbid them to emigrate. It has worked on behalf of the disappeared and tortured in Chile and in the gulags of the Soviet Union. It has stood up for the rights of workers, journalists, and other human rights defenders. And I hope that this Congress and future Congresses will not abandon that history, but will continue to stand up in a bipartisan way. This is a nonpartisan issue, but to continue to stand up for the rights of the disenfranchised, both at home and abroad. And that's why this project, the Defending Freedom Project, is so important. This is a collaborative, bipartisan initiative spearheaded by the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission that invites members of Congress to adopt cases of individual prisoners of conscience around the world, take an active stance on their behalf, generate attention to their plight, and raise support for human rights. With the adoption of a prisoner, members of Congress could contribute to the release or reduction of their prison sentence, or at the very least raise awareness about the unjust laws and policies of the countries where these prisoners are detained. So today I invite all my colleagues to take part in this effort. Only action and courage and the ability to see outside the prescribed narrative and the inability to stay passive in the face of injustice can lead humanity toward a positive change. You know, the hope for a better future rests on the shoulders of those who dare to challenge the status quo, to break out of the chains of fear imposed by repressive societies, and to accept immense risks for exercising their basic human rights. So let's not leave them alone in their struggle. Let us make their names a part of every conversation with the governments that restrict their freedom. And let us send these prisoners of conscience a message that you are not alone, that we stand with you, and we are fighting for your freedom. And I, again, want to thank Congressman Wolf for his leadership on this, and appreciate very much to be part of this gathering.
Great. Thank you, Jim. I appreciate that very much. I'm going to introduce Mr. Smith, Mr. Duncan, Mr. Holk, and make opening comments, and then we'll call on Robbie George to begin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, both chairs, for calling this extraordinarily important hearing. And with that, I would ask unanimous consent that my statement be made a part of the record. I'll just say a couple of points. First of all, the idea of political prisoners or prisoners of conscience, they really are the barometer of a nation's health or lack of health when it comes to human rights, democracy, fundamental freedoms. And over the years, it has been both my and I know Chairman Wolf's distinct privilege to meet political prisoners, both in prisons and throughout the world, at embassies, at venues that sometimes were very clandestine, to speak out on their behalf and to let them know that we stand in solidarity with them. I'll never forget a trip in 1982 in my first term to Moscow and Leningrad on behalf of Soviet Jewry with the National Conference on Soviet Jewry. We met with Natan Sharansky's mother, who made an impassioned plea to us to speak out. He was very sick and said, if you don't, I'm fearful, that's his mom talking, that he will die, and he will die a very painful death. We all did. And he got the medicines at that time that he was so desperately in need of. A few years later, Frank Wolf and I were in Zeeland, Holland at a human rights conference. And while we were there, the Procurator General for all of the Soviet Union was there bragging about how open they were and they had nothing to hide. So our hands went up and we said, well, we would like to go to Perm Camp 35 and visit Natan Sharansky. He hesitated for a moment and then said, but of course you can go. 2 years later, and it took 2 years of ongoing negotiations, we got into Moscow and then made our way to Perm Oblast, 1,000 miles outside of Moscow in the Ural Mountains. they tried so hard to discourage us even while we were there, and said, oh, there are some technical problems. You can't get in to see the prisoners, because Natan Sharansky had just been released a few months before that. And we said, okay, we'll have a press conference. See ya. Frank pounded the floor or the table, and he said, we're marching out of here, and we're going to have a press conference. All of a sudden, the trip was back on, a plane was available, and we made our way to Perm Camp 35. We videotaped the entire thing. We were told, and this shows you the Potemkin village mentality of torturers and dictators, we were told that they had so much to eat in Perm Camp 35, and we were taken into the cafeteria, and Frank will remember this so well. They actually had a menu with the caloric content of every food, and every single table had a piece of half-eaten bread on it, and yet when we met with every one of the prisoners there and videotaped them, every one of them looked totally emaciated, heads were shaved, and it was just a terrible, terrible big lie. And we said, look, we're not buying it. They were told that they had expert medical care, so we went to the medical clinic. I leaned up against the wall, and I had the whitewash all over my jacket, and we were told by the prisoners that, what? We have a health clinic here? So nobody bought their big lie. And unfortunately, this kind of disinformation is replicated around the world each and every day. In China, and we will be hearing from Gao Zhejiang's wife, Gung Hu, just recently, and Frank was a part of this, we had a hearing where we heard from 5 daughters, all of whose dads are suffering torture in that gulag state called the People's Republic of China. Every one of them appealed to the Chinese government, but they equally appealed to the United States government to step up to the plate and initiate a more robust defense of political prisoners in China and everywhere else. We sent a letter to President Obama asking that he meet with the 5 daughters, and I reiterate that request here again. We still haven't heard back. So while it's bipartisan here in this meeting room, we have not even gotten a response back, and Gung whose daughter was one of those who testified and did so eloquently. We also have, just Vietnam. I see several people who are very concerned about, including Dr. Tong, about the ongoing repression in Vietnam, which is in a race to the bottom with the People's Republic of China and North Korea. Vietnam is in a death spiral. Everywhere you look, the political prisoners from Father Lee, the Venerable Thich Quang Do, and all the others, rounded up under house arrest or being tortured in that gulag state. All the while, members of Congress and many in the administration say, oh, we're cooperating with them. Cooperate on human rights. That is the barometer of how well or poorly and how healthy or unhealthy a country is. And of course, I could go on, whether it be in places like Syria, the Middle East, where political prisoners are proliferating. Saeed Abedini, as Frank Wolf did in this commission, and then we did it in my committee several months later. Naghmeh is desperately asking for a more aggressive engagement by the United States and by the West on behalf of her husband, who is now in a hellhole prison in Iran. So I just will finally say this. The political prisoners are the ones who push back. They are the ones who refuse to be coward or compromised. They are the ones who selfishly suffer torture, deprivations of every kind, even unto death. And they are the ones that if we listen to them, they show the way to peace, to reconciliation, and durable respect for fundamental human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Mr. Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chris, thank you for your passion for human rights issues, and you're definitely a leader on this. I want to begin by thanking the co-chairs Wolf and McGovern. Frank Wolf, you're going to be missed, and thank you so much for your leadership. And you've been a inspiration to a lot of us to get involved with human rights issues, and you're going to be missed, and I know you're going to still be engaged, and I look forward to your continued leadership with regard to the Defending Freedoms Project. We're supporting prisoners of conscience, and I'm honored to be able to take part in today's hearing and listen to the valuable testimony of our distinguished witnesses, and I hope that we'll be able to raise enough public awareness of the plight of these individuals and ultimately resulting in more vigorous U.S. State Department action on their behalf. and eventual freedom for those that are oppressed. And I realize the witnesses today may focus on the violations of individual liberty in China and Bahrain and Vietnam, but I'd also like to highlight the deliberate and intentional targeting of religious minorities in Iran. I chose to adopt a prisoner of conscience, Iranian pastor Farshid Fathi. And I've got a letter here that I sent to Secretary Kerry on January 15th on Pastor Fathi's behalf. I'd like to enter that into the record.
That objection.
He's been imprisoned and even imprisoned since December 2010. He was accused of being a Christian, having Bibles printed, and running a network of house churches in Tehran. Formerly detained with American-Iranian Saeed Abedini, Pastor Fathi has been serving a 6-year prison sentence simply for his faith in Jesus Christ. Pastor Fathi's wife and 2 children fled Iran and were resettled in Canada, where they've been offered refuge. The Iranians have labeled Pastor Fathi's belief in Jesus and desire to share his faith political offenses. Political offenses, equivalent to actions against national security. Yet Pastor Fathi is not alone in suffering persecution in Iran. Since June 2010, more than 300 Christians have been arbitrarily arrested and detained throughout that country. As part of this past Christmas, at least a dozen Christians remain in prison. Iran's appalling violations of individual liberty have no place in today's world, and I'm deeply concerned about the state of religious freedom today. And I'd like to submit into the record the letter, and I pray for his freedom, and hopefully this letter and hearings such as this will spur the Department of State into action on behalf of not only this pastor, but all these that you see behind us and all those that will be talked about in this hearing today, because it's the right thing. It's the right thing for us as members of the United States Congress to do. Unfortunately, the Natural Resources Committee will have a markup and votes around 10:30, so I will have to leave at some point in time, and I'm going to stay as long as possible. Again, I'll reiterate my thanks to you two gentlemen for this project and for this hearing, and I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan. Mr. Holcomb?
Well, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank all the members for allowing me to join you today and have just a moment. But I especially want to thank Commission Co-Chairman Frank Wolf and Jim McGovern for convening this important hearing. I want to just take a moment to say thank you, especially to Co-Chairman Wolf, who has been truly a mentor and hero on so many issues. I worked up here 25 years ago, and even then looked up to you greatly and see you as someone that would love to have a little bit of following in your footsteps of the work that you've done here. So thank you. We appreciate you so much. I also want to commend each of the panelists testifying here today and the organizations that they represent for their tireless efforts on behalf of prisoners of conscience everywhere. I wholeheartedly support your work. This hearing presents the ideal opportunity for me to bring attention to the plight of one prisoner of conscience in particular, Zhu Yufu. Today, as I speak, Zhu Yufu is spending his 696th day behind the walls of the overcrowded Jiaxing Prison No. 4 in China. An advocate for democracy, Christian dissident, and poet, Zhu Yufu started the May 4 Monthly, a pro-democracy publication, and was elected head of the magazine. Subsequently, he was often summoned by authorities, and his house was frequently searched. Zhu actively supported the students' democracy movement and was one of the founders of the China Democracy Party. For this, Zhu was arrested on the false charge of inciting subversion to state power, sentenced to prison, and deprived of his political rights. He is a prisoner of conscience, unable to enjoy the fundamental freedoms enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Today, Zhu Yufu languishes in prison. He suffers from many diseases, and his health is extremely poor. Prison authorities refuse to let him seek treatment or medication. According to Zhu's wife, prison regulations to relieve overcrowding permit Zhu to be eligible for community supervision or medical parole, yet prison authorities refuse to transfer him. In fact, they have explicitly denied Zhu's release on the basis that he is a political prisoner who opposes the state. Zhu is the only eligible prisoner in the entire prison who is being denied release. Zhu Yufu cannot speak for himself, so others, including myself, must advocate on his behalf. Last year, as part of the Defending Freedoms project of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, I adopted Zhu Yufu as a prisoner of conscience. Through this and similar adoptions by my colleagues in Congress, we seek to pierce the darkness and shatter the silence that has enveloped Zhu Yufu and others like him. Silence is not an option. Silence means Zhu Yufu likely will remain in prison and the government of China will elude accountability for its deplorable human rights violations. Thank you so much for this opportunity to shine a light on the plight of Zhu Yufu and for the efforts of everyone here who are raising their voices on behalf of prisoners of conscience. Thank you, Co-Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Holcomb. I appreciate it very much. Our first witness will be Dr. George, Robbie George. Dr. George is chair of the Bipartisan U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, is the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. He's a prolific writer and thinker with a deep personal commitment to America's first freedom, religious freedom. Dr. George, we appreciate being here. Your full statement will be put in the record. You can summarize as you think appropriate. Welcome.
My thanks to all the members of the Commission, and particularly to Co-Chairman Wolf and McGovern for holding today's hearing and inviting me to testify in my role as Chairman of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. I commend this Commission for launching the Defending Freedoms Project and the Commission's co-chairs, Representatives Wolf and McGovern in particular, for their long-standing leadership in the struggle for human rights. Representative Wolf, I want to echo the lovely statement that Co-Chairman McGovern made. All of us who work for human rights, I must say, felt our hearts sink when we heard the news that you would not be seeking re-election. You have been a great leader in this Congress and in this country in the cause of human rights, and we console ourselves with the knowledge that you will continue to be a leader in the struggle, although occupying a different role. I also want to say what a great honor it is for me to be testifying at a hearing at which you will also be hearing from so many distinguished advocates of human rights, people who are advocating on behalf of their own relatives in some instances, and many, many others who are the subjects of human rights abuses. In particular, I want to say what a great honor it is to be in the presence of one of my heroes, Natan Sharansky. In my earliest days, as a human rights activist, it was his example of courage in the face of human rights abuses that inspired me and so many other young people when he was in prison and then recently out of prison in the Soviet Union. Any human rights advocate, any organization that regards itself as a human rights organization should be proud to stand alongside Natan Sharansky to advocate for human rights. I'm also delighted to be here with my principal co-conspirator on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom in the Cause of Human Rights, Dr. Katrina Lantos Sweat, herself, of course, a very distinguished human rights advocate and the daughter of one of our nation's most distinguished human rights advocate, Tom Lantos, for whom this commission is named. The Defending Freedoms Project works with members of Congress to advocate on behalf of prisoners of conscience across the globe. Members stand in solidarity with them, as we've heard this morning from the members who are here, raising the cases of these victims, these prisoners, at the highest level of international and national affairs. All of us want these prisoners to know that they are not forgotten and they are not alone. We want to draw attention to the laws and policies that led to their imprisonment, and we want to hold their governments accountable. We want them to be freed. Now, while quiet diplomacy certainly has a role to play, public inattention to the plight of these victims can lead to more persecution, not less. We're so often told, stay quiet, don't antagonize the oppressors. It'll make the situation worse. And yet the situation gets worse in that silence. And at its worst, that silence, that so-called private diplomacy, can be perceived by the oppressors as a license for oppression. Governments need to be publicly prodded, publicly called out through hearings such as the hearing today to honor the human rights of their people and to fulfill their obligations to protect the rights of all their citizens, including members of religious and other minorities. Now, the Defending Freedoms Project basically boils down to people. People too often are detained for who they are, for what they believe, and how they've chosen to express their convictions. These prisoners of conscience have been unjustly prevented from enjoying fundamental human rights enshrined in landmark human rights instruments such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 or the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, as well as other international conventions and instruments. To help ensure that these brave souls are not forgotten, I request that the project's prisoners list be included together with my testimony in the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, as USCIRF's chairman, let me make a special point about religious freedom and its importance. Enshrined with other human rights in international treaties and understandings, freedom of religion or belief is vitally connected with other basic civil liberties, including the basic liberties, the freedoms of expression, association, and assembly. They come as a package. As it is often religious freedom that is the first right taken away, religious freedom serves as that proverbial canary in the coal mine, warning us that other liberties will be denied. Once religious liberty goes, it will be a short space of time before the others are also jeopardized. Supporting religious freedom abroad is a key component of our foreign and diplomatic policy, and it's a legal and moral duty. But it's also a practical necessity, crucial for the security of this country and of the world. Research confirms that religious freedom in countries that honor and protect this human right is associated with democratization, with rising economic and social well-being, and with diminished tensions and violence. Nations whose governments trample on religious freedom are substantially more likely to be and to remain mired in poverty and insecurity, war and terror, and violent radical extremism. People so often fail to see that one of the most important things we can do to promote democracy abroad and to fight against terrorism abroad and at home is to promote religious liberty. Numbers also reinforce the importance of religious freedom abroad, with a recent study finding that 1/3 of all nations, comprising 75% of the world's population, severely restrict religion through governments or societal actors' actions. In these countries, many of which top the U.S. foreign policy agenda, religion constitutes their core narratives, and religious freedom violations are among the catalysts for their problems. The U.S. signaled its intention to strengthen its support for religious liberty overseas with the signing into law in 1998 by President Clinton of the International Religious Freedom Act, IRFA, which also, of course, created our commission, the Commission on Religious Freedom. The act, in addition, created an ambassador at large for international religious freedom within the State Department, a position that is currently vacant, and we urge to be filled immediately. The IRFA Act also created the category of countries of particular concern, a status for countries engaged in or tolerating systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom. Now, neither Democratic nor Republican administrations, alas, have issued this designation of countries of particular concern on an annual basis as they are required to do under the Act. We urge this administration and all future administrations, and as it was said, this is not a partisan issue. Democrat and Republican administrations need to stick to the law here and make these designations on an annual basis so that they can have the good effect that Congress wanted them to have. So we urge them to do it. Now, IRFA also demanded, or mandated, that the State Department compile a list of prisoners of conscience. While the Department has advocated for individual prisoners, and we applaud that and has done a good job in many cases, as far as we at USCIRF can determine, the Department has not created that comprehensive list. Now, it's time to do that. So we urge the Department to rectify this situation by doing this, by creating that list as promptly as possible. The Defending Freedoms Project has compiled and maintains a list of prisoners of conscience itself, with unfortunately no shortage of names on it. We commend those members of Congress, some of whom, of course, are with us today, who have adopted prisoners. And we urge other members to join this campaign because many countries continue to arrest and hold prisoners of conscience, including the following. Bahrain. The Bahraini people in 2011 began protests for greater freedoms, to which the government responded with a crackdown that led to a human rights crisis and abuses committed against the Shia community. Nabil Rajab, whose pro bono attorney Josh Colangelo-Briones is with us today, languishes in prison along with others. Representative McGovern, to his very great credit, and we thank him, has adopted Nabil Rajab, as he mentioned. This is Nabil Rajab. People like him must not be forgotten. They must not be regarded as, or allow them to be thought to be alone. China. The Chinese government commits widespread human rights violations. Congressman Smith spoke all too truly, alas, when he called it a gulag state. Hundreds of thousands of people are currently detained without charges and without trials. Religious freedom conditions for Tibetan Buddhists and Uyghur Muslims, among others, remain particularly dire. The government also harasses, detains, intimidates, disbars, and imprisons attorneys who have the temerity to defend members of vulnerable religious groups. Gao Zhizheng is one of these attorneys. This is Gao. He is one of the most respected human rights lawyers in China, for which the Chinese government disbarred him and tortured him, concealing his whereabouts for nearly 20 months. And he's imprisoned him in northwest China. With us today is Gao's wife, Gang Hu, who along with her children has been granted asylum in the United States. Accompanying her is Jared Genzer, founder of Freedom Now and pro bono counsel for Gao. Representative Wolf, and we thank you, has adopted Gao Zhizheng. Iran. The Islamic Republic of Iran's severe human rights and religious freedom abuses include the following: arbitrarily and unlawfully arresting and torturing people, imprisoning people, some of whom are in life-threatening conditions, and killing people. Moreover, the regime severely restricts the freedoms of assembly, speech, press, and religion, and denies the Iranian people the right to free and fair elections. Pastor Saeed Abedini, a United States citizen, has been serving an 8-year prison sentence since January 2012 for, quote, threatening national security, unquote, due to his involvement in Iran's Christian house church movement. This is Pastor Abedini. After holding him in solitary confinement in Evin prison, the Tehran regime transferred him last November to the forbiddingly harsh Gohardasht prison. Representative Trent Franks, and we thank him, has adopted Pastor Abedini. Pakistan. Serious human rights problems in Pakistan include extrajudicial and targeted killings, forced disappearances and torture, and the government engaging in and tolerating systematic, ongoing, and egregious violations of religious freedom. Pakistan's repressive blasphemy laws and other religiously discriminatory measures, including anti-Ahmadi laws, have created an atmosphere of violent extremism and vigilantism. Asiya Bibi, whom Representative Pitts has adopted, and we thank Representative Pitts, is one of 40 cases of Pakistanis jailed under the blasphemy laws that Yusuf has documented. Asiya Bibi. Now, these people should not remain invisible with their names unknown. It's our job to make their names known until that regime relents. I request, Mr. Chairman, that this list be submitted for the record. Russia. Given the upcoming Sochi Olympic Games, I would be remiss if Russia was not brought up today for restricting civil liberties by, among other measures, adopting laws that impose harsh fines for unsanctioned meetings, targeting NGOs as, quote, foreign agents, unquote, for receiving foreign funds, denying detainees due process, and not bringing to justice those responsible for the deaths of prominent journalists, activists, and whistleblowers, including Sergei Magnitsky. Russia recently released some prisoners of conscience. Of course, we're glad for them, but did so because President Putin, not an independent judiciary, so determined. These actions signal not a change in policy, alas, but a quest for positive publicity prior to the Games. We're happy, as I say, that those who have been released have been released. But let us not forget the others. And let us not be lulled into believing that this represents a fundamental change. As long as those other prisoners are detained in Russia, we need to stand with them. And I'm honored to be here today with Mr. Sharansky, a former Soviet prisoner of conscience and human rights advocate, who will, of course, testify in a few minutes. Saudi Arabia. The Saudi government continues to ban most forms of public religious expression other than that of the government's own interpretation of one particular school of Sunni Islam. The government also continues to prosecute, convict, and imprison individuals charged with crimes such as apostasy, blasphemy, and sorcery, and sporadically detains Shia Muslim dissidents. Now, in May of 2012, the Saudi government detained two Saudis, Sultan Hamid al-Anusi and Saud Falah Awad al-Anusi, for the crime of becoming members of the Ahmadi community. These blank pages are all that we have available, all that I have, to call attention to these victims of oppression and prisoners of conscience. We cannot even obtain pictures. While they're facing the death penalty for apostasy, they have been disappeared. Their current whereabouts and status are unknown. So I today call, and I hope you will join me in calling on the government of the kingdom to release these men who are guilty of no crime other than to exercise their right as human beings to religious freedom. And I call on our own government, and I hope you will join me in this as well, to press the Saudi government for the release of these Ahmadi prisoners and to cease and desist the harassment and oppression of this and other minorities. Vietnam. The government of Vietnam commits significant human rights violations, including severely limiting the freedoms of speech, press, association, and religion. Congressman Smith was again all too accurate, alas, in referring to Vietnam as a gulag state. It arbitrarily arrests and detains people and mistreats them and denies their right, the other fundamental right that's worth mentioning here today, that is a right to a fair and expeditious trial. Mrs. Jun T. Ngoc Min, mother of imprisoned Vietnamese labor activist Do Thi Minh Han, will be testifying today. Father Lee, whom Representative Smith has adopted, and we're so grateful, is someone whose cause USCIRF has followed for years. A moment ago, I mentioned Do Thi Minh Han, and Do Thi Minh Han, and I should make her face known to us here today as well. Now, Father Lee. Father Lee, this clergyman, attempting nothing more than to serve his people, has spent more than a decade and a half in prison for the causes of religious freedom, democracy, and human rights. Let's all join together in calling for his immediate release and the immediate release of all other prisoners of conscience in Vietnam and in oppressing states across the globe. While the world has undergone some positive changes in the last decades, grave challenges remain, making it incumbent on all of us to stand up for religious freedom and other human rights and for these and other prisoners of conscience. It's been said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Well, ladies and gentlemen, in my view, that arc will bend towards justice if, but only if, people of conscience like ourselves, who enjoy, as we in the United States do, the blessings of freedom, are prepared to stand up and speak out on behalf of those prisoners of conscience whose freedoms are being denied. Let's make the use of our freedom to stand up and speak out for their freedom. Let's make our freedom worth something. The arc may be bending toward justice, but it won't bend on its own. It depends on our choices and actions. The fate of prisoners of conscience will be determined by our willingness to use our precious freedom to defend their precious freedom. Again, Congressman, Co-Chairman, thank you very much for this opportunity, and God bless you for all the wonderful work that this commission does.
George, thank you for your testimony. Mr. McGovern?
Well, you have given us a bunch of assignments
Yes.
in your testimony. So I've been jotting down all the things that we need to do and press the administration to do, including dealing with this the issue of appointing a U.S. ambassador for international religious freedom and the importance of of being more forthright in raising these issues. I mean, look, and this is the kind of the predicament we always find ourselves in. It doesn't matter who's in the White House, but it seems that it's always easy to highlight human rights abuses in countries that we have no economic ties to or no military ties to, and then it becomes more complicated when we're dealing with countries like China, Russia, even Bahrain, because of our military presence there. And you mentioned that that there are multiple ways to raise these issues publicly and privately. But I guess is there ever an instance where where it serves any good for our government to be quiet? I mean, I understand the importance of backdoor diplomacy, but even in Russia, I mean, Frank and I worked very closely together, along with Chris Smith on the Magnitsky Act, trying to highlight the human rights abusers in Russia and those who are guilty of corruption. And we were expecting a second Magnitsky list to come out, and then we have the Olympics, and Khodorkovsky gets released, not by through the judicial process because Putin says so, and a few others get released, and then we get nothing. And it's frustrating because it seems that economic and military issues kind of take precedence over human rights, and and I think you kind of commented on it, but I don't know if you have anything else to say about how we kind of resolve this dilemma that we constantly find ourselves in.
Well, I want to thank you and Mr. Smith and all the members of this commission and the commission staff for keeping the heat on not only the regimes that are oppressing people and violating their human rights, but also our own administrations, whether they're Republican or Democrat, to keep the heat on those others. I mean, clearly you're right. There are so many incentives to look the other way, to tone down the advocacy of human rights because of our legitimate economic and military concerns. But let me make a point that I think isn't made often enough. The defense of human rights and the elevation of human rights, and especially the right to religious freedom in our foreign and diplomatic policy, is not just a good moral idea. Under the act passed by this Congress and signed into law, it is the law. It is the law. Designations must be made when certain criteria set forth in the law are met. This is not optional. Now, I'm a lawyer and a professor of jurisprudence. I believe in the rule of law. I'm sure the members of this commission do. I'm sure the members of this Congress do. I'm sure that the people in the administration do. But we need to remind ourselves, if we believe in the law and the rule of law, then it's our duty to carry it out. And the law really does require these things. That law elevates religious freedom, in particular, to a very high level of priority in our foreign and diplomatic policy. And we have to remember that. We have a legal obligation here. The administration has a legal obligation here. We've got to live by that. Now, you raised this issue of quiet diplomacy, which I mentioned early in my prepared remarks. I think there are some times and places where that's the way to go. But at most times and in most places, we need public advocacy. Even oppressive regimes, in most cases, care about their public relations in the world. They often care about economic matters or military matters. They often need us as much as we need them when we're dealing with them on economic and military matters. And so it's very, very important to speak out. And if something's being done by quiet diplomacy, let's make sure it's being done and quiet diplomacy doesn't become an excuse for standing aside and doing nothing or becoming inattentive to what's going on because we have bigger fish to fry. And above all, Congressman McGovern, above all, and I'm not trying to preach to you because I know you know this as well as I do. Above all, we can never allow ourselves to fall into the trap of imagining that we can sacrifice human rights here and now for a greater good sometime later. Human rights is an imperative that always is making its demand in the form of concrete people, human beings who are being oppressed here and now. They can never be sacrificed for a greater future. Mm-hmm. We mustn't fall into that trap.
Well, thank you very much. You gave us a kind of a comprehensive list of to-dos that we're going to have to follow up on. Let me just close with this. In addition to being inspired by people like Frank Wolf and Chris Smith and Tom Lantos, when it comes to human rights, the thing that I always keep in the back of my mind is several years ago I tried to go to Sudan, and I couldn't get a visa to go into the country, so I went to Chad and went to the border and visited some of the refugee camps. And this was at the time the International Criminal Court was gathering evidence against President Bashir. And I remember observing one of the interviews with the people from the International Criminal Court, and this young woman, who had experienced this terrible atrocity, she saw her entire family murdered before her very eyes. And I remember she sat there very calmly and in excruciating detail recounted the tragedy that unfolded before her. And when it was over with, they asked me if I wanted to meet her, and I didn't know what to say. I just said, I appreciate your courage in being able to do this, and I don't know how she could have done it. And she said to me that the only reason why she was able to give that testimony, and the only reason why she even wants to be alive and not end her life, is because she thinks by telling the story, people will care, that it will matter, that no one else will have to go through this. And I'm always haunted by that one visit because, I don't know why, through fate, I was born here, and I can say whatever I want to and not have to be thrown in jail. But people should have the same freedoms and rights that I do. And but I'll never forget that visit in that refugee camp. And so these are all very personal issues to us, because as we meet with the families and those who have been harassed, it takes on a whole new dimension. I mean, this is real life. It's not abstract. And so I thank you for your work, and please be assured that we're going to take your recommendations very seriously, and we're going to follow up. So thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll be very brief. Dr. George, thank you for your very eloquent testimony, for the details, which, the International Religious Freedom Act, as we all know, was authored by Chairman Frank Wolf in 1998. It was rigorously opposed by the State Department and by the administration, vigorously. I held hearings on it. The only part of the act that is working, and I think working extraordinarily well, even beyond expectations, is your commission. Your recommendations on CPC, which I hope someday will be listened to and absorbed by the State Department, is a roadmap. You lay out in clear detail which countries ought to be elevated to CPC, and you do so with great specificity. And I think that you do an enormous and valuable service for the dissidents and for all believers, and even non-believers, because religious freedom is a hallowed right, and everyone benefits when it's respected.
Well, let me thank you for that kind vote of confidence, Congressman Smith, and I want to thank you on behalf of everyone associated with USCIRF. It's a team effort over there. We have been blessed with a magnificent staff of incredibly dedicated, hardworking, knowledgeable people, and it's really an honor to be able to do this human rights work. And thank you for reminding us of who the driving force was behind the Religious Freedom Act.
Without a doubt. And the prisoners list, I think your point is very well taken. You know, that was included, as well as the teaching of foreign and instruction of foreign service officers, FCO, as to religious freedom issues. I'm amazed at the deficit that exists throughout the State Department on all things related to religion. And finally, you made a very profound statement. Public inattention leads to more persecution, not less. Quiet diplomacy may have, that ought to be the exception, not the rule.
Exactly.
Regrettably, it is the rule and not the exception. And the Natan Sharansky, who is a giant with almost no equal in the world, Schultz, Secretary Schultz, Ronald Reagan, and every member of Congress, both sides of the aisle, who cared about human rights, always talked about Sharansky. And so there was nothing quiet about that advocacy. And certainly President Reagan, and when Secretary Schultz would visit Moscow, he would meet with the dissidents. They would flock to the embassy, and it was right, you know, we risked nuclear superpower confrontation, because obviously both the Soviet Union and the United States had missiles lined up against each other, and yet human rights was at the top of the list, not somewhere on page 5 or 6 or as an asterisk. So thank you again for what the Commission does. And again, it is an honor just to be in the presence of Natan Sharansky.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Just briefly, if you have any thoughts, what Senator Jackson did, I read this book over the holiday, what Senator Scoop Jackson did on making this the issue. Any ideas you have as you can think about it, or the Commission, of what we can do to make this a national issue, so it's on the lips of all the American leadership and members of House and Senate on both sides. But as we go on, if you can think of, I mean, how do we move this process? I mean, how do we get every member of Congress to adopt a prisoner of conscience? How do we do all this? And if you have any thoughts now, or if you can think about it, maybe you can have some of your top people come by to see us, to see if there's some things that we can do. I think it's really going to have to be done outside of this institution in some respects. In the book that I read, and the author is going to be here today, I think he lays out how it was done. It would seem like it's almost a model, and I'm glad he wrote the book. Maybe others have too, but to sort of lay it out. But do you have any thoughts on how we can do what Jackson and Mr. Lantos did in the 70s and 80s? How we can do that in 2015, 2016, 2017?
Well, I have a few thoughts, and Chairman McGovern has noticed I'm good at giving assignments, so we'll be back to you from the Commission with some more assignments. But just sort of off the top of my head, holding a hearing like the hearing today is a very important thing to do. And this shouldn't be a one-off thing. I know that alas, you're going to be retiring, but Chairman McGovern will be here, Congressman Smith will be here. Let's keep the Lantos Commission going very strong on the religious freedom issue, holding hearings like this that call the public's attention to the problems and what we as a nation can do to fulfill our responsibilities, both moral and legal, to come to the assistance of those who are being oppressed. I think you need to, looking back at the experience of Senator Jackson, the leadership of Senator Jackson and President Reagan, and the role that was played by dissidents themselves like Natan Sharansky, engage the diaspora communities, the Vietnamese American community, the Korean American community, the Chinese, the Iranian American community. They are, of course, deeply concerned about those who are being victimized in their native or ancestral homelands. And they can be very powerful allies as well as sources of information. We at USCIRF really treasure those relationships we have with the diaspora communities, in part because they keep us informed. We get information that's otherwise not available through those communities. Get the religious communities activated. You know, invite them in to work with you, to testify before you. Be in touch with them. This remains a very religious country, and we have all the great religions of the world now represented in this country, and religious leadership can play a very important role here, I think. So religious leaders from across the spectrum, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, Sikh, Hindu, Baha'i, they should all be friends of the Lantos Commission, who are involved with the work that you are doing in the same way that the diaspora communities should be. They can also help to get the word out. I don't think it should be forgotten that American Jews and American evangelical Christians, to their very great credit, were leaders in the fight to make the oppression of Soviet Jews a real issue in our domestic politics. Well, let's look at how that model worked, and let's do that with Vietnam and with Iran and with Pakistan and with Egypt and down the line. So there's, I think, one thing concretely that this commission can do, building on the hearing that you've held today to launch this.
Well, we will, and I appreciate that. I noticed, too, as I look around, a lot of young people in the audience, which is very good, too. Thank you very much for your testimony. I appreciate it.
My very great honor, and thank you, and congratulations, and God bless you.
Thank you. The next panel, the last panel that we have, we'll hear from Gung Hu, the wife of a Chinese lawyer and prisoner of conscience Gao, under constant surveillance and harassment in China. She and her 2 children sought asylum in the United States in 2009 after a harrowing escape through Thailand. She's been a passionate advocate for her husband. She's joined by Jared Gensler, founder of Freedom Now, a non-governmental organization that works to free prisoners of conscience worldwide. Mr. Gensler provides pro bono legal representation for Gao and has done so for several other notable individuals, including a prisoner, the Chinese Nobel Prize winner, Xiaobo. And I appreciate it, too, you guys who are lawyers doing pro bono for that. I won't ask you how much you bill an hour, but I know it's good. No, I really do appreciate it, and it's nice to see that that's being done. And next we will hear from Joshua Palanjo Bryan, a senior attorney at Dorsey and Whitney, LLP in New York. He's a pro bono attorney on behalf of imprisoned Bahraini human rights activist Nabil Rahat Rajab, who co-chair Mr. Govern has adopted, and I appreciate you putting your time and effort in coming down here. The next witness is Mrs. Jung, mother of imprisoned Vietnamese labor activist Do Thi Minh Han. She journeyed from Austria. Sometimes you can't get the administration of either party to journey from 20th and Constitution Avenue here. She journeyed from Austria to plead for her daughter's case. And as I've already mentioned, we will have the unique opportunity to hear from Mr. Natan Sharansky. Katrina Lantos Sweat, whose father, the late Tom Lantos, is the namesake of this commission, will formally introduce Mr. Sharansky at the time, given her family's personal advocacy on his behalf while he was in prison. And finally, we'll hear from Gal Beckerman, journalist and author of the book When They Come for Us, We'll Be Gone, the epic struggle to save Soviet Jewry, which, on a personal note, I recently enjoyed reading over the break and found very inspirational. I thought there's some ideas here that you could take to rekindle, before the flame goes out, to rekindle and do that. But I want to thank all of you for being here. So we'll go in that order, and when we get to Mr. Sharansky, we'll have Katrina can come up and introduce him.
尊敬的各位议员、先生们、女士们，大家好。对我先生日夜的担忧呀，已经成为我日常生活中的一部分。来美国5年了，我那种绝望和无助时时涌在我的心头。我担心高志胜遭受迫害，甚至迫害致死。更担心国际社会遗忘了他，因为这是一个国家对一个家庭的迫害。 我个人根本无能为力，只能以美国为代表的国际社会发出正义的声音，才能对我的丈夫提供实质性的帮助。我格外的感谢，你们今天举办这个听证会，是你们支持着我和高志胜在寻求正义的道路上前行。
Respected co-chairman Wolf and McGovern and members of the committee and Chairman Smith and ladies and gentlemen, I'm very concerned about my husband's well-being, Attorney Gao Zhisheng, and which has become part of my daily life. And having come to the United States almost 5 years ago, this kind of desperate, helpless, and hopeless feelings remain in my heart day and night. I am deeply worried about whether he has been, severely tortured, abused, or even killed, perhaps out of anyone's knowledge. Moreover, I worry about that he may be forgotten by the international community. Because of the persecution to our family was done by comprehensive state-run machinery in China. And I am personally powerless to do anything to help him. Only the international community represented by the United States can speak with a voice of truth that can provide help to my husband. And therefore, I'm particularly grateful to you all for holding this hearing, which give me and my husband, Gao Zhisheng, the strength and hope to continue our journey on the road to justice.
高志胜是一名中国的律师，他始终为弱势群体提供帮助，尽其所能的为穷人提供免费的服务，依靠自己的律师职业向大众宣传公平和正义的人权理念，运用他自己娴熟的法律知识，去为受害人讨回公道，因此赢得了很高的声望和民意。
Yeah, my husband, Gao Zhisheng, is a Chinese lawyer with great reputation for his work to protect the interests of the vulnerable groups and the individuals. And he does his best to provide free legal services for the poor and the voiceless. And through his professional, as a lawyer, he has disseminated the concept and the practice of justice and the human rights to the general public. His legal knowledge and skills and eloquences in the courts, of course, have brought justice to a victim many times. So as a result, he has won the respect of the Chinese people.
2005年起，他开始为那个受迫害的那个基督徒、法轮功和其他受迫害的群体办案。中共政府就开始公开的对他打压报复。关闭了他的律师事务所，吊销了他的律师执照，并在2006年8月15号非法绑架了他。在2006年12月22号，以煽动颠覆国家安全罪判刑3年，缓刑5年。当时是使用的缓刑5年，在缓刑5年的期间呢，就有6次以上的强制失踪，最长一次的失踪是长达20个月。 每一次的失踪都伴随着各种的苦刑。
Back in 2005, my husband Gao has begun to handle cases of persecuted Christians and persecuted Falun Gong practitioners and other victimized groups in China. And the authorities began to target him for his work, and the government shut down his law firm and revoked his legal license as an attorney in practice. In August 2006, police illegally kidnapped him. On December 22nd, 2006, he was charged with the crime of inciting subversion of the state power and was sentenced to 3 years in prison, suspended for 5-year probation. During the 5-year probation, he was disappeared more than 6 times, and the longest disappearing was about 20 months without any knowledge where he's about. And every disappearing was accompanied by various types of torture and abuses. And 4 days before the end of his probation, the state-controlled Xinhua News Agency reported that Gao Zhishan would spend the next 3 years in prison. At the end of 2011, he was secretly transferred to an extremely remote, harsh conditional prison in Xinjiang, the northwest province of China.
记得在2007年9月，高志胜给美国国会写了一份公开信，揭露当时呢就是中共当局以举办奥运，践踏人权的事儿。为此呢，中共警方再次将高志胜戴上了黑头套，将其绑架。这次的绑架长达50天左右。绑架的当天呢，他们把他带到一间黑房子，脱光了衣服暴打，然后用电警棍，电击他的全身和生殖器，令他身体剧烈的抖动，汗水泪如雨下，溅湿了一地。电击的皮肤呢，就是说，电击致全身皮肤乌黑，没有一块正常的皮肤。完了以后呢，他们又使用酷刑，警察用香烟熏他的眼睛，用牙签扎他的生殖器，使他那个小便失禁。警察常常对他说的一句话就是：我们想让你什么时候消失，就让你什么时候消失。
I remember that back in September 2007, my husband wrote an open letter to U.S. Congress exposing the human rights abuses by the Chinese Communist regime for the construction of 2008 Olympic Games. And for this activity, and the Chinese police had kidnapped him again, and he was disappeared from the public for more than 50 days. And on that same day, he was kidnapped, and they brought him to a dark room and took off all his clothes and beaten him, and used electrical police to beat him all over the body, including his private part, and used the cigarette butt to target his eye, and he lost consciousness. And it was really everybody, all over the body, there was stains and scars because of the abuse and torture. And so the police man often told him that if we want to, we can let you disappear anytime.
就在缓刑到期的前4天，中共对外新华社报道说，从高志胜未来3年要在监狱，然后就在2011年年底，秘密把高志胜押往了新疆遥远的新疆沙雅县监狱。最新呢有关他的消息是2013年的1月12号，警方终于允许家人与高志胜见面，但见面的时候呢，就说，禁止家人问高志胜在里面的任何情况，如果要问，立即终止会见。到今天为止呢，又整整的1年了，不允许家人见面。在这1年中呢，家人他们以各种的理由拒绝家人见面，也拒绝律师会见。我想就是说，新一届领导人上任了，就是说，丝毫没有改变高志胜现在的处境。
Right, as by the end of the probation that the official Xinhua News Agency made an announcement, said that, quote, Gao Zhishan will spend the coming 3 years in prison. And by the end of 2011, he was secretly moved to a remote prison in northwestern part of Xinjiang on the border. The latest news that we learned about him was January 12, 2013, and the family member was permitted to meet him, but was forbidden to talk about anything about his condition in prison. And in case the family want to learn something about it, and such a meeting would be stopped immediately. And by today, and it's more than a year now, we have never had a chance to meet him again, including the family attorney. The police department used all kind of excuses to stop such a kind of meeting possible. And I hope that with the new leadership in China, there should be a hope, but the reality was very grim, and we hope there must be something done about it.
高志胜遭受迫害已经8年了，在这8年中呢，警察强行住过我的家，全天候的监视我和孩子。给我和孩子造成了很大的精神和心理的创伤。最终不让女儿上学，我带着孩子逃离了中国。我和孩子对中共专制的政权的无法无天和恶劣行径，非常的了解，刻骨铭心。他们以谎言和暴力维持着他们专制的统治，法律也成了他们实行暴力和谎言的工具，真是无耻至极。
My family has been subject to brutal persecution for 8 years. And during this period, the police had forcefully lived in my house and watched over me and my children and prevented my daughter from going to school. And all these has caused me and my children severe mental and psychological trauma, and ultimately forced us to flee China. To me and my children, the crime of the communist regime in China are an unforgettable nightmare, and the government ruled there by terror and deception. And the law has simply become a tool for their violence and a lie to the Chinese people. And it's shame on the Chinese police and shame on the Communist Party in China.
今天我来到了这里，我恳切希望就是奥巴马总统和凯瑞国务卿能公开表达对高志胜的关注。我也希望美国的议员、欧洲的议员、各国的政府官员都能通过你们的方式表达对高志胜的支持。每当你们给高志胜公开的写一封信，每当你们在一个公开的场合提高志胜的名字，每当你们申请要求会见高志胜，都会对高志胜提供有所帮助，都是对高志胜的莫大的鼓舞和支持。你们的帮助不仅会给黑暗监狱中的高志胜带来以光明和鼓舞，也会对中国所有追求民主和自由中国人的帮助。
And today I stand here in the U.S. Congress. I asked Mr. President Obama and Secretary of State John Kerry to publicly express their concern about Mr. Gao Zhishan, and your voices of justice will not only shine in the dark prison of Gao Zhishan, but also light up and inspire all those who suffer in China for the freedom and human rights that they all long deserved. I also want to urge the Congress members of Democratic and Republican leaders, and the members of European Parliament as well, to use your efforts and to rescue Mr. Gao Zhishan. Whether you write a letter supporting him or you express your concern publicly, and all these efforts provide support, encouragement, and protection to Gao Zhishen. And further, every word, deed, and action to help Gao Zhishen will be very much appreciated and in support the pursuit of democracy and freedom for all the Chinese there.
Thank you.
最后，我向那些为高志胜呼吁的人们表达我心中的感谢。感谢汤姆兰托斯政权委员会将高志胜列为捍卫自由奖项的第一人，还要感谢史密斯、麦考温 and 沃尔夫。沃尔夫，您在给高志胜的信中引用马德·路德·金的话：“最终我们记住的不是我们敌人所说的话，而是我们朋友的沉默。”我希望在这个关键的时刻，高志胜沉默朋友的名单中没有奥巴马总统和凯瑞国务卿。谢谢。
Finally, I want to express my gratitude to all the individuals and groups that care about my husband and express their support to rescue Gao Zhishen. I especially want to thank the Thomas Lantos Human Rights Commission and the Congress man that Mr. Wolf and Mr. McGovern and Mr. Christmas, and for selecting Gao Zhishen on the list of first defending freedom prisoners. I would like to close by citing the paragraph of Congressman Wolf's letter to my husband and quoting the Martin Luther King Jr. Ultimately, we remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friend. I hope that at this critical moment, President Obama and Secretary John Kerry will not be on the list as Mr. Gao Zhishen's silent friend. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gensler, do you want to make any comments?
Sure. I'll just say a few things briefly. First, let me just thank the Commission and all of the people here today for their stalwart support on Gao Zhishen's case. I think what we need right now on his case is a special level of vigilance, because he is supposed to be released according to Chinese law in August of 2014. And you know, we have repeatedly requested high-level meetings for Gung He with the administration, and sadly have been repeatedly denied those meetings. This time around, we requested meetings with Dr. Susan Rice and Secretary Kerry. Neither of those meetings are going to be happening, and we're having yet another low-level meeting over at the State Department with the Acting Assistant Secretary for DRL, which, of course, I'm always happy to see our friends in DRL, but practically speaking, the low-level attention given to this case speaks volumes about whether or not it's a priority for the administration. And one way or another, we hope, of course, Gao is still alive, but he will be coming out of prison, we hope, in August. And we desperately need the administration and the Congress to make clear to the Chinese government now that not only do we expect him to be freed in August, or of course sooner, which we have demanded over and over again, but that also he'll be allowed to leave China and to be united with his family in the United States, which is something that they've desperately been waiting for and desperately deserve. Let me just lastly say that with respect to the Defending Freedoms Project, I'm very grateful for its existence and for the hard work that all of you are putting forward. I've spent my career as a lawyer advocating on behalf of prisoners of conscience. And in many respects, I see the freedom to be free from arbitrary detention as, in certain respects, the first freedom. Because ultimately, unless one is free from arbitrary detention, one cannot exercise really any freedom, except perhaps freedom of thought in one's own brain, in one's own prison cell. But beyond that, you can't do anything. And so your work is exceptionally important, and I would just lastly note that that my NGO, Freedom Now, has prepared some draft legislation, which we'll be happy to share with all of you, about how the U.S. government can be much more effectively focused on the plight of prisoners of conscience more broadly, including creating an ambassador at large for prisoners of conscience to be based at the State Department, to be the never-ending clarion call for every time a U.S. government official meets with foreign government leaders, to ensure that there is a list when it is a repressive country of people who should be free. But there are a whole range of actions, I believe, that the U.S. government could be doing to prioritize freedom for prisoners of conscience around the world, and I'll look forward to working with all of you and your staff on that. So, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative Wolf. I am honored to speak today on behalf of Nabil Rajab, a Bahraini human rights activist who has been imprisoned since July 2012. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here, and it goes without saying that we are immensely thankful to Representative McGovern for the manner in which he has taken up Nabil's case. There actually was a time when no one could have imagined that Nabil was to be a prisoner of conscience, a victim of the Bahraini government's determination to suppress all dissent. Nabil was born in 1964 to a prosperous family that enjoyed good relations with Bahrain's ruling family. In his young adulthood, Nabil was essentially an entrepreneur, operating small businesses while also marrying and having 2 children. Ultimately, though, the pursuit of profits was not Nabil's true calling. In the 1990s, he began to focus on human rights matters, inspired by political unrest and significant human rights abuses that were prevalent in Bahrain at the time. When King Hamad announced reforms that allowed civil society groups to form, Nabil co-founded the Bahrain Center for Human Rights in 2002, which focuses on issues such as torture, extrajudicial killing, and the abuse of migrant workers. Displeased ultimately with the center's work, the Bahraini government officially disbanded it in 2004. I take it that isn't a commentary on my remarks so far.
That's a vote.
Thank you. Despite that official disbanding of the center, Nabil has ensured that it continues to function, and most critically since February 2011. Of course, in February 2011, massive pro-democracy demonstrations erupted in Bahrain. The Bahraini government responded to those demonstrations by shooting and killing unarmed and peaceful protesters, beating detainees to death, and engaging in large-scale political prosecutions. Those crimes were detailed in the report of the Bahrain Independent Commission of Inquiry, which was created by the king to investigate such matters. Since 2011, Nabil and the center have continued to investigate and report on human rights abuses, providing essential information for the international community whose representatives too often have been denied entry into Bahrain. The center has lobbied the European Union, the United Nations, and national governments. Nabil himself has come to Congress to speak with members about the situation in Bahrain. We should note, though, that Nabil's focus has never been parochial. He has long worked on human rights matters outside of Bahrain, advocating for people regardless of their sect, their nationality, their citizenship, or their background. Simply by way of example, Nabil championed basic due process rights for those detained at Guantanamo Bay. That work, which was on behalf of people perceived to be Sunni extremists, earned Nabil, as a secular Shia, some ill will from people in his community in Bahrain, given that Bahrain has suffered from sectarian polarization over the years. Nonetheless, from Nabil's perspective, that work was simply a matter of principle, and it did not matter the sect or the religion of those for whom he was speaking. In a similar vein, he was a founder of the Gulf Center for Human Rights, an NGO that works to protect human rights defenders of all stripes throughout the Gulf region. He serves on an advisory committee for Human Rights Watch and was the Deputy Secretary General for the International Federation of Human Rights. Unfortunately, Nabil's advocacy on behalf of those in his own country has led him to pay a very heavy and very personal price. In the early morning, on April 18th, 2011, assailants lobbed tear gas canisters over a garden wall surrounding Nabil's home and the home of his elderly mother. She, who suffered from respiratory illness, suffered significant distress as a result of that attack. Then in January 2012, riot police beat Nabil as he was leaving a pro-democracy protest and beat him so severely that he needed hospital care. Beginning in the summer of 2012, the government took a slightly different tack and started subjecting Nabil to political prosecutions. In June, a court fined him after he tweeted that police had failed to protect civilians from an attack by an armed group. Another court sentenced him to 3 months imprisonment, again based on a tweet, this one which said that Bahrain's prime minister no longer enjoyed support in a particular town in Bahrain. According to prosecutors, that tweet was offensive and in fact criminal because the sensibilities of residents of the town were offended. Following that conviction, mass security forces arrived at Nabil's home and roughly seized him, taking him from his 2 young children who watched the entire episode and bringing him to prison. When Nabil's lawyers attended an appeal in that case, on the very same day and at the very same time, authorities brought Nabil from prison to yet another courtroom. There, the judge convicted him in 3 separate proceedings for attending unapproved pro-democracy demonstrations. The court sentenced him to a 3-year term, which was later reduced to a 2-year term. Nabil is currently serving that sentence, and it was only in December that he was denied an early good behavior release, a finding that certainly seems contrary even to Bahraini law as it's written. Of course, Nabil is not unique in being subjected to these sorts of injustices in Bahrain. We've seen a Bahraini court sentence opposition activists to life imprisonment simply for peacefully protesting in favor of the creation of a republic in Bahrain. We've seen a Bahraini court sentence a nurse to prison after she allegedly stepped on a photograph of Bahrain's prime minister. Conversely, Bahraini courts have convicted security personnel of shooting or beating people to death and issued sentences of as little as 6 months when those personnel have been convicted at all. Nabil recently called me from prison. He didn't really want to talk about his own circumstances, perhaps in part because the call was being monitored, but in point of fact, Nabil has never been overly concerned with himself. His focus has steadfastly been on the well-being of others. So he asked about my family, and he requested that I pass his thanks on to Representative McGovern. For years, Nabil has spoken out on behalf of people who are unable to speak out for themselves. Now that he is in prison, it is my privilege to speak out on his behalf. Hopefully, by bringing attention to the injustices that have been visited upon Nabil, we can remind Bahraini authorities that Nabil has not been forgotten, but rather that we will continue to press the government to treat him in accordance with international laws and standards, and in fact, to release him promptly. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. We're going to change the hearing slightly. There is a vote, so Mr. McGovern and Mr. Smith will go. I'm going to stay here, and so the hearing continues because people have come from so far. Mr. Sharansky has an airplane. He has to leave no later than 12. So what we're going to do is I'm staying here. We'll continue, but we'll go here and then we'll jump back and then we'll come. Katrina, if you want to introduce Mr. Sharansky, I would appreciate it.
Yes, it's my great privilege and honor to be here today with all of you, and it is a particular joy for me to have the privilege of introducing Natan Sharansky. I come to today's hearing on the Defending Freedoms Project and Prisoners of Conscience wearing really a few hats. I am Vice Chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, and I serve as President of the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice. But as has also been mentioned, I am the daughter of Tom Lantos, and I just can't fully put into words how much it would mean to him to know that his old friend and someone he cared incredibly deeply about, someone he had adopted, and we think of that word adoption as implying that your family, once you're adopted, your family, and that's how he felt about Natan Sharansky. So it's very special for me to be with him here today. When I think of the extraordinary man I am about to introduce to you today, his story does speak to my heart in profound and indelible ways. First, for years, Natan bravely endured a Soviet gulag for the crime of daring to demand his right to live in the land of his forefathers. Second, it was my father who, along with many others, including his distinguished colleagues who are before me now, and above all, Natan's remarkable wife, Avital, just a tower of inspirational strength and love and dedication, who worked day and night to secure his freedom and that of others like him. Finally, against all odds, freedom came. But what is significant, I think, to realize is that it came not just to Natan Sharansky, but ultimately to hundreds of millions of others. Why? Because he and others took a stand, and those of us here in this country with them. And by taking that stand, a tyrannical regime lost its legitimacy, and we ultimately saw it crumble before our eyes, something that very few of us could have anticipated. And now, of course, today, Natan Sharansky remains an advocate for liberty against every form of oppression and enslavement. He was, before he became an icon of international democracy and human rights activism, a champion at chess and math, which I think is an interesting little tidbit about his history, something that I envy and admire greatly. And of course, he has gone on to embody the ultimate in what it means to be a human rights activist. And Natan Sharansky is living proof that we can change our world, but we can do so only if we heed Winston Churchill's simple but unforgettable advice about life, and I quote, "Never, ever, ever, ever, ever give up." If we apply these words each day to freedom's cause, we will see more miracles like the miracle that happened for Natan Sharansky, for the family members of those gathered at this table, and countless more that they represent. And so it is my true honor, privilege, and joy to introduce to you today Natan Sharansky.
Thank you, Katrina. Mr. Sharansky, welcome.
Okay.
We're honored.
Thank you. Thank you, Katrina. And I think there is no better way to keep memory about Tom Lantos but to have this committee going, working. And I'm glad to welcome here also two congressmen who were together with me in prison, Chris and Frank, and James McGovern. Dear friends, I'll try to be very brief because I believe the most important thing is to hear the stories which we just now start hearing, like the very dramatic story of Chinese dissident, of Bahrain dissident, and we'll hear more. And when you listen to these stories and you think it's the same brutal physical force which tries to keep under the control the minds of the people, and then you think, but what really stops the leaders of the world to speak very proudly and powerfully against it? What prevents them from putting it at the top of the negotiations with China, with other countries? And it's so clear what it stops. And we know all these arguments, and we know this explanation that China is so extremely important for America and for its future economic, our economical future. And in view of these tremendous challenges which we have with China, with all our sympathy to this story of this woman, of the Chinese lawyer who suffers at this moment, but it's only story of one person, and we are speaking about millions and hundreds of millions of people. So we, the leaders, have to take into account their fate, and in spite of all our sympathy, to be silent. And then, with all for those who stick to this logic, I want to remind that there was Soviet Union, which was a superpower, which was believed to be equal to America. America believed that Soviet Union can destroy it in one day. And that's why America thought that Soviet Union, which here exists forever, we have to take it seriously. And at the same time, there was a very small group of dissidents in the Soviet Union who believed that Soviet Union is doomed to disappear very quickly. Read some of the books of my friends, dissidents, Andrei Malrik and Andrei Sakharov and others, who were predicting in the 60s and the 70s that Soviet Union will disappear because it's so weak from inside, because it simply tries to control, spends all its superpower to control the minds of 200 million people. And if only the West will stop feeding it, it will fall apart. And this small group of dissidents was keeping alive the spark of freedom, which gave hope to hundreds of millions. And that's what, in the end, defines the future of the world. But this small group of dissidents could never survive. We never could survive even one day in the Soviet Union if our struggle was not the struggle of all the free world. First of all, on the public level, the moment we had demonstration of 10 people and went to prison, there were hundreds of thousands who went on demonstrations. And hundreds of thousands of letters which were sent every day to prison when we were in prison. Until this day, I meet people who say that as school children they were sending to me letters, and did they receive them? And I tell them frankly, I never received, but it's so good that you sent, because KGB received. Every day KGB received thousands of letters, and they knew what's happening. And of course, that from the very beginning it became the struggle of this house, of Capitol Hill. I had a long list of my accomplices, official in KGB files. They were called accomplices, beginning from Senator Jackson, and then Senator Kennedy, and Humphrey, and Javits, and Father Drinan, and Fenwick. When we created our Human Rights Watch, here on Capitol Hill, Congressman Fenwick and Father Drinan created their Human Rights Watch. And that was real partnership. And that's what kept us alive. I remember when I was arrested. I just now we heard the wife of Chinese dissident that he was told, if you want, you'll disappear anytime. I don't know exact translation from Chinese of what they said, but that's exactly what I heard in Russian from them. They said, you are in our hands. You'll disappear. Nobody will know about you. What you hope? You hope that the West is now keeping your name at the top. How long your name will be mentioned in the press? Think for yourself. America, free world, has so many problems, has so many challenges. So they'll talk about you 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, that's it. And we are here forever. So you will disappear. And they sincerely believe that that's what will happen. And the fact that year after year, American legislators not only spoke, but put it into legislation, made a direct linkage between my fate Andrei Sakharov, Yuri Orlova, Stan Ginsburg, refuseniks, and the most important interest of Soviet Union. That's what in the end defined that they didn't kill me, they didn't kill the other, that one after another they started releasing us, and the moment they started releasing us, the moment they stopped, lost control over the brains of their people, the Soviet Union simply could not survive, and the world became a much more safe place. And that's what's very important to remember when we are speaking today about dissidents in China, or in Bahrain, or in Korea, or in Iran. And when people say, but there are only few people, well, 600 political prisoners in Iran, but it's 600, but there are tens of millions who are supporting that regime, and Iran is such an important threat for the world. So we have to take it seriously. We have to negotiate how to appease them. If we will not make, as a part of our negotiations, part of our policy towards Iran, the fate of these 600 political prisoners, the fate of everyone who led this revolution in 2009, the world will be a much less secure place. So if I'm really upset with something, is why, while discussing to do sanctions, not to do sanctions around this threat of Iran, human rights is not there. If you want to make sure that Iranian threat will not be a real threat to the West, you have to make sure that the voices of human rights activists in Iran are protected. And the fact that practically there was not a one meeting of any serious congressman or senator with Soviet officials when there was not presented the list of people who are in prison, the people who want to leave Soviet Union, the list of Pentecostals who want to teach their children to their faith, and that's why they arrested. So not a one meeting. How many lists of prisoners from China, from Iran, from Bahrain, from Korea, from many other dictatorships in the world? How many of these lists are on the table of negotiations between the United States of America and all these countries? And here is also present my friend David Keith, who is running the organization Advancing Human Rights. I think, among other things, they came with a great idea. In the past, there was the square in Washington in front of Soviet embassy was called Sakharov Plaza. So each time they had to write something to Soviet embassy, they had to mention Sakharov. Why not to do it in front of Iranian embassy, in front of every embassy of every dictatorship in the world, to name the streets in America and other free countries of the world? And that will be the best reminder that the world cares, the world remembers, and we will not permit, how they said, if you want, you will disappear. If we want, they will not disappear. That's what's important. Thank you.
Well, that was very powerful. We don't, and they have 8 votes, and if they missed their votes, I will acknowledge that they were here. But we're going to get your statement, and I know you have a plane, and put it in the congressional record. We're also going to set it down to Fred Hyatt and others at the Washington Post and others to say, you know, this is just from the heart, if you will. And thirdly, I just looked at Mr. McGovern, and if we can get a list of 5 embassies, we can have the rubble square in front of the Bahraini embassy, and we'll do in front of the Chinese embassy. We'll ask the D.C. City Council to do this, but that's a great idea, and we will do it and get those letters off. But thank you for taking the time, and God bless you. Thank you. And I know you have a plane, so you don't, you know.
They want to listen to the story.
Okay, next, again, I apologize. Why don't you go ahead so he can hear. Thank you.
I will not hear your story.
Kính thưa quý vị, trong Ủy hội Nhân quyền Lantos, tôi là Trần Thị Ngọc Minh. Hôm nay tôi có mặt ở đây để trình bày câu chuyện về người con gái út của tôi là Đỗ Thị Minh Hạnh, 28 tuổi, một tù nhân lương tâm tại Việt Nam. Chỉ vì giúp đỡ những công nhân khốn khổ, những nông dân bị Cộng sản cướp đất, cướp nhà, mà con tôi bị nhà cầm quyền Cộng sản Việt Nam bắt giam vào tù.
Members of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, I'm Trần Thị Ngọc Minh. I'm grateful to be here today to speak about my daughter, our youngest child, Đỗ Thị Minh Hạnh, 28 years old, who's also a prisoner of conscience. And she became prisoner of conscience simply because she was helping the poor factory workers and assisting farmers whose lands and homes were wrongly expropriated by the Vietnamese Communist government.
Có lẽ quý vị ngồi đây, tại nước Mỹ này, quý vị không thể biết hết tình cảnh của công nhân tại Việt Nam. Những người trực tiếp làm ra của cải, trong đó có những hàng hóa do họ làm ra được bán sang Hoa Kỳ. Họ đã sống và làm việc trong những điều kiện hết sức tồi tệ. Họ cư trú trong những khu nhà thiếu tiện nghi, mất vệ sinh, chật chội. Có hàng trăm vụ công nhân bị ngộ độc thực phẩm từ bữa ăn do công ty xí nghiệp cung cấp. Họ phải làm việc từ 12 đến 15 giờ mỗi ngày, nhưng chỉ được trả lương bình quân $70 mỗi tháng. Nhiều trường hợp bị chủ không trả lương, không đóng bảo hiểm, sa thải khi ốm đau, gặp tai nạn lao động thì không bồi thường đầy đủ. Họ không được quyền thành lập công đoàn riêng để bảo vệ cho mình.
Perhaps as you sit here in the United States of America, you do not know fully the conditions of the factory workers in Vietnam, those who created wealth, including commodities such as shoes, clothes, and other merchandises, which were sold to America. They have to work in abysmal conditions and live in slums and unsanitary housings. There have been hundreds of cases of food poisoning as the employers provided factory workers with spoiled food. They work 12 to 15 hours per day and only get paid $70 per month on the average. In many instances, they do not get paid, have no health or social security insurance, are fined for getting sick, and receive insufficient compensation if injured at work. They do not have the right to found independent labor unions to protect themselves.
Con gái tôi cùng Nguyễn Hoàng Quốc Hùng, Đoàn Huy Chương và nhiều người khác đã đến giúp đỡ công nhân đấu tranh với giới chủ, bảo vệ các quyền tối thiểu của họ, nhưng cả ba người đều đã bị nhà nước Cộng sản Việt Nam bắt, đánh đập và kết án nặng nề. Trước đây, luật sư Lê Thị Công Nhân và nhiều người khác tham gia thành lập nghiệp đoàn độc lập đã bị kết án nhiều năm tù. Riêng Lê Trí Tuệ đã trốn chạy sang Campuchia, xin cao ủy tị nạn Liên Hợp Quốc che chở, vẫn bị công an Việt Nam sang bắt đi mất tích. Đến nay đã được 6 năm.
My daughter, Đỗ Thị Minh Hạnh, and her two friends, Nguyễn Hoàng Quốc Hùng and Đoàn Huy Chương, along with others who sympathize with the desperate situation of these factory workers, helped the workers to defend their basic rights, but all three were arrested, beaten, and given severe sentences. Before them, attorney Lê Thị Công Nhân and those attempting to form independent labor unions had been sentenced to long prison terms. Particularly, Lê Trí Tuệ had to flee to Cambodia to seek the protection of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, but he was reportedly abducted by the Vietnamese police and has disappeared for the past 6 years.
Con tôi bị bắt vào ngày 23 tháng 2 năm 2010 tại Di Linh, Lâm Đồng. Tại đây, tôi đã chứng kiến công an bắt và đánh con tôi bể miệng, chảy máu đầy mặt, sau đó đưa đi biệt giam 8 tháng tại Bộ Công an rồi mới đem ra xét xử.
My daughter was arrested on February the 23rd, 2010 in Di Lâm Đồng province, and I witnessed the police beat her, causing serious injuries to her mouth and bleeding all over her face. She was later put in solitary confinement for 8 months at a facility belonging to the Department of Public Security before being brought to trial.
Phiên tòa lần thứ nhất vào ngày 26 tháng 10 năm 2010 tại Trà Vinh. Con tôi cùng 2 người bạn không có luật sư bảo chữa và công an đánh đập tàn nhẫn con tôi trước sân tòa. Cả 3 bạn trẻ bị kết án, Hùng 9 năm tù giam, Chương và Hạnh mỗi người 7 năm tù giam. Giữa tháng 3 năm 2011, Công an trại giam Trà Vinh đã cho tù nhân hình sự đánh đập con tôi tại phòng giam. Tháng 4 năm 2011, khi chuyển trại giam từ Trà Vinh về Long An, con tôi đã bị còng tay, xích chân, bịt miệng và bị đánh đập trong xe thùng chở tù. Ngày 6 tháng 5 năm 2011, con tôi lại bị chuyển về Bình Thuận. Tại đây con tôi bị chuyển qua nhiều phân trại giam. Công an cưỡng bức con tôi làm cá xuất khẩu. Con tôi liên tục phản đối cưỡng bức lao động trong nhà tù. Cuối tháng 4 năm 2013, con tôi bị chuyển đến trại giam Đồng Nai. Con tôi cũng bị cưỡng bức làm hạt điều xuất khẩu. Con tôi đã phản đối việc cưỡng bức lao động và ngược đãi tù nhân, thì bị công an cho nhiều tù nhân hình sự đánh con tôi cùng một lúc. Trong đó một lần bị đánh khi đang tắm không mảnh vải che thân. Hậu quả là con tôi đã đau đầu, thần kinh đầu. Con tôi bị teo và đau nhức một bên ngực trái và có khối u trong ngực, nhưng nhà tù không cho điều trị chuyên khoa. Để uy hiếp tinh thần của con tôi và gia đình tôi, ngày 2 tháng 10 năm 2013, công an chuyển con tôi cùng với nữ tù nhân tôn giáo Mai Thị Dung từ Đồng Nai đến Thanh Xuân, Hà Nội. Trên đoạn đường dài hơn 1.700 km, cả hai đang vẫn bị trói tay, xích chân trong thùng xe như những con vật và họ đã bị ngất xỉu nhiều lần. Từ khi con tôi bị bắt giam cho đến nay, công an luôn ép buộc con tôi nhận tội để được khoan hồng, nhưng con tôi không chấp thuận.
At the first instance trial by the Provincial Court of Trà Vinh on October 26, 2010, my daughter and her 2 fellow activists had no defense lawyer, and I saw the police beat her again, brutally in the court's yard. They received heavy sentences, Hùng 9 years, Chương and my daughter each 7 years of imprisonment. In March 2011, the Tra Vinh province police let common criminals beat my daughter up badly. In April 2011, while being transferred to Long An, she was handcuffed, her legs shackled, and her mouth gagged. She was beaten during the journey. On May 6, 2011, she was transferred to Binh Thuan and moved through different camps. There, my daughter repeatedly opposed forced labor imposed on her. At the end of April 2013, my daughter was transferred to Dong Nai province, where she was forced to process cashew nuts, and she opposed that as well. When she protested against forced labor and mistreatment of other prisoners, the police let a number of criminal inmates physically assault her. Once, she was beaten while taking a shower and being all naked. Due to those beatings, she suffered nervous pain. In addition, her left breast became atrophied and the pain was severe. But the prison administration did not allow her to see specialists for medical treatment. To intimidate my daughter and our family, on October 2nd, 2013, the government transferred my daughter and a religious prisoner, Mrs. Mai Thị Dung, from Dong Nai to Thanh Xuân, Hanoi. On this long journey of more than 1,700 kilometers, both of them, despite being seriously ill, were handcuffed and shackled in the van like animals. They lost consciousness several times. Since her arrest, the police has pressured my daughter to admit to having committed crimes as condition for leniency, but she has refused.
Thưa quý vị, bao năm nay, Đảng Cộng sản Việt Nam đã lừa dối cả thế giới, lừa dối Liên Hiệp Quốc và cả chính phủ Mỹ về vấn đề công nhân và lao động tại nước chúng tôi. Tổng Liên đoàn Lao động Việt Nam hiện nay là do Đảng Cộng sản thành lập. Tất cả các cấp lãnh đạo đều là đảng viên Đảng Cộng sản. Chủ tịch là ông Đặng Ngọc Tùng, Ủy viên Trung ương Đảng Cộng sản. Mục đích của họ là để giám sát và kiểm tỏa công nhân, giúp đảng khai thác bóc lột công nhân. Từ năm 1995 đến nay, đã có gần 5.000 cuộc đình công của công nhân. Những cuộc đình công đó do công nhân tự tổ chức, dưới sự hướng dẫn và giúp đỡ của những người hoạt động nghiệp đoàn bí mật. Công đoàn Nhà nước Việt Nam không đứng về phía họ, ngược lại còn cho công an đàn áp, bắt giam những người tổ chức đình công.
Ladies and gentlemen, for all these years, the Vietnamese Communist Party has deceived the world, deceived the United Nations and also the United States about workers and labor unions in my country. Vietnam General Confederation of Labor, VGCL, was established by the Vietnamese Communist Party. Its entire leadership is composed of communist members. Its president, Mr. Đặng Ngọc Tùng, is a member of the Vietnamese Communist Party's Central Committee. VGCL's purpose is to monitor and control the workers and help the party to take advantage of them and exploit them. Since 1995, there has been close to 5,000 strikes by workers. These strikes were organized by the workers themselves without the guidance of the labor organizers who operate, with the guidance of labor organizers who operate secretly. The labor union set up by the government has never been on their side. On the contrary, they provided information to the public security police to crack down and arrest the leaders or workers who organized the strikes.
Hiện nay, có hàng trăm tù nhân lương tâm đang sống trong địa ngục trần gian tại các nhà tù Cộng sản Việt Nam như con gái tôi, như nhà sáng lập Công nông Đoàn kết Đoàn Huy Chương, sinh viên Nguyễn Hoàng Quốc Hùng, linh mục Nguyễn Văn Lý, mục sư Nguyễn Công Chính, blogger Nguyễn Bắc Hải, tiến sĩ Cù Huy Hà Vũ, doanh nhân Trần Huỳnh Duy Thức, luật sư Lê Quốc Quân, sinh viên Đinh Nguyên Kha, tín đồ Mai Thị Dung, tín đồ Nguyễn Văn Lĩa, nhà báo Tạ Phong Tần, cựu chiến binh Nguyễn Hữu Cầu, dân oan Trần Thủy Thủy, v.v. Tôi xin cung cấp cho Ủy hội Nhân quyền Tom Lantos danh sách gần 600 tù nhân chính trị và tôn giáo kèm theo. Danh sách tù nhân này do các cựu tù nhân chính trị và thân nhân, bạn bè các tù nhân cung cấp thông tin. Với danh sách các tù nhân này, tôi mong được quý vị và các tổ chức nhân quyền trên toàn thế giới quan tâm đến họ cũng giống như con tôi vậy.
Presently in Vietnam, there are hundreds of prisoners of conscience who live in hell on earth. That is what prisons in Vietnam truly are, like my daughter. They are United Farmers and Workers Organization member Đoàn Huy Chương, college student Nguyễn Hoàng Quốc Hùng, Reverend Nguyễn Văn Lý, Pastor Nguyễn Công Chính, journalist Nguyễn Văn Hải, Dr. Cù Huy Hà Vũ, businessman Trần Huỳnh Duy Thức, attorney Lê Quốc Quân, college student Đinh Nguyên Kha, person of faith Nguyễn Văn Lía, journalist Tạ Phong Tần, South Vietnamese veteran Nguyễn Hữu Cầu, victim of justice Mai Thị Dung, on and on. I would like to present to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission the list of some 600 political and religious prisoners as attachments. These lists have been compiled by advocates in Vietnam and family members of those prisoners themselves. And with that list, I hope that this commission will mobilize the world to work on getting them, set them free unconditionally.
Tôi biết đã có nhiều tổ chức quốc tế đến Việt Nam để thị sát cuộc sống của giới công nhân, nơi giam giữ tù nhân. Các tổ chức ấy đã bị nhà nước Việt Nam lừa gạt bằng cách chuẩn bị sẵn một số nhà trọ của công nhân, nhà ngục của tù nhân rất tiện nghi sạch sẽ, huấn luyện một số công nhân và tù nhân, nói về phái đoàn các nước những lời tốt đẹp nhưng dối trá về điều kiện ăn ở, làm việc tại nước Cộng hòa xã hội chủ nghĩa Việt Nam.
I know that there are many international organizations coming to Vietnam to inspect the living conditions of workers and the detention conditions of prisoners. These organizations have been deceived by the Vietnamese government, which prepare some nice and comfortable living compounds for workers and some clean cells for prisoners just for show, and train a number of workers and inmates to speak highly but deceitfully about the workplace or prison conditions in the Socialist Republic of Vietnam.
Ít ai biết rằng đằng sau bức tường được trang trí xinh đẹp là địa ngục khủng khiếp của tù nhân. Hàng trăm nhà tù to lớn trải dài khắp trên đất nước Việt Nam là những công xưởng sản xuất hàng hóa xuất khẩu như hạt điều, hàng thủ công mỹ nghệ. Người tù làm việc không được đạt chỉ tiêu sẽ bị biệt giam hay bị trừng phạt. Cai tù và nhà tù ngày càng giàu thêm nhờ việc bóc lột những người bị giam giữ.
Few people are aware that behind the beautifully decorated walls is the living hell that prisoners must face. Hundreds of prisons spreading throughout the country are factories producing goods for export, including cashew nuts and handicraft products. Prisoners do not meet the quota, are sent to solitary confinement or punished. Prison wardens and authorities have become increasingly wealthy by exploiting detainees.
Tôi rất ngạc nhiên và cảm thấy chua chát khi nghe các phát biểu của nhiều chính khách, các bản điều trần của một số chính phủ, một số tổ chức ca ngợi nhà cầm quyền Cộng sản Việt Nam đang có tiến bộ về nhân quyền, về chính sách tôn giáo, về chế độ lao động.
I'm very surprised and feel bitter when hearing statements by politicians, reports by a number of governments and organizations that laud the Vietnamese government for its progress on human rights, its policies towards religions and labor conditions.
Kính thưa quý vị, tôi hiểu quyền lợi kinh tế quốc gia đối với nước Mỹ là tối thượng. Nhưng đối với chúng tôi, nước Mỹ cũng là tấm gương tranh đấu cho nhân quyền. Vì vậy mà tôi có được hôm nay tại nơi đây.
Ladies and gentlemen, I understand that economic interests are of top priority for the United States. However, in my eyes, the United States is also the role model in the fight for human rights. That's exactly why I'm present here today.
Tôi thỉnh cầu quý vị, bằng vị thế của mình, xin hãy dùng mọi cách để áp lực với nhà nước Cộng sản Việt Nam, trả tự do vô điều kiện cho con tôi và tất cả những tù nhân lương tâm. Nhất là trong khi Hoa Kỳ đang thương thảo hiệp ước đối tác xuyên Thái Bình Dương TPP với nhà cầm quyền Cộng sản Việt Nam.
I respectfully pray to you that, from your vantage point, please use all means to pressure the Communist government of Vietnam to unconditionally release my daughter and all prisoners of conscience, especially as the U.S. is negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, with the Communist government of Vietnam.
Tôi cũng tha thiết thỉnh cầu quý vị giúp đỡ tôi kịp thời can thiệp với nhà nước Cộng sản Việt Nam cho gia đình tôi bảo lãnh con tôi ra ngoài để đến bệnh viện điều trị căn bản mà chúng tôi nghi với triệu chứng ung thư đã phát hiện có khối u trong ngực trái của con tôi. Đỗ Thị Minh Anh.
I also respectfully request your intervention to get the Vietnamese government to allow my daughter to be released from medical treatment because she got diagnosed with breast cancer.
Xin cảm ơn quý vị. Nguyện cầu Thượng Đế chúc lành cho Hoa Kỳ và cho quý vị.
Thank you, and may God bless the United States of America and all of you.
Thank you very much.
Just out of curiosity, is there anybody here from the administration, State Department here? You are? Good. Have you been observing all of this? Okay, and we'll make sure you get all of the testimony so you can share it with the Secretary. If you can, I don't need your name now, but if you can just give your name to a member of my staff so we can get it to you, the transcripts. Thank you. Finally, is Gail Beckerman, a journalist who wrote the book, When They Come For Us, We'll Be Gone, The Epic Struggle to Save Soviet Jewry. As I said, I read it over the Christmas break, and it was very powerful. And so I want to hear what you have to say, but I think a lot of the ideas, and I wrote a lot of notes, could almost be applied to all of these cases here.
Mm, yeah.
And so you might, I don't know what you're going to tell us, but as you explain how you built this movement, this movement was built up, leading to the release of Sharansky and all. But if you have not read the book, I would encourage you to go out and get the book. But why don't you go ahead?
Well, thank you so much, and it's such a great honor to have been invited by the Commission, and I want to thank Congressman Wolf in particular for taking such a great interest in the book and thinking that I would have something to contribute here today. On a spring day in Manhattan in 1964, 50 years ago this coming May, the very first protest on behalf of Soviet Jewry took place. A group of about 1,000 well-dressed college students, the boys in black suits and thin dark ties and the girls in dresses, lined up in 2 rows in front of the Soviet mission to the United Nations and began marching and chanting. In their seriousness, one could feel an echo of the protests then taking place for civil rights down south. But the cause they were supporting was in many ways an abstract one, not one roiling their own society. They were demanding of the Soviet Union to allow its Jews to be allowed to have some kind of Jewish identity, and if that was not possible, to let them immigrate from a country that normally did not give its citizens any right to freely leave. So what motivated them to argue for the rights of these distant Jews, far away on the other side of the Iron Curtain, people who they had never met and at that point could not even communicate with? 2 factors. First, these protesters were young people whose parents were racked with guilt for not having done enough to stop the Holocaust. Then just 2 decades passed. This inherited feeling of shame motivated the children. The student group who planned that first march, they were called the Student Struggle for Soviet Jewry, had a simple chant for that day's event in 1964, "History shall not repeat." So, at one level, this protest emerged out of a feeling of obligation to one's brethren, Jews who felt they needed to help other Jews for the most tribal of reasons. But there was another motivating factor. These students were offended by the Soviet Union's violation of basic human rights, its abrogation of the right to religious freedom and the right to leave one's country, which are both enshrined in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And they were tapping into a generational desire to make change. Some of these protesters, some of these students would soon leave the streets of Manhattan that summer of 1964 and try to register African-American voters in Mississippi. So the particular and the universal. These were the two intertwined factors that pushed these students to take up the cause, and it was the engine that I think propelled this movement forward. The tribal motivation to help one's own, overlapping with the fundamental desire for freedom shared by all humanity, the particular and the universal. And this wonderful overlap is what made the Soviet Jewry movement one of the most effective human rights struggles in history. That small protest of students eventually became a mass struggle. It led to the groundbreaking Jackson-Vanik Amendment, passed in 1974, the first real piece of American legislation that directly linked our foreign policy to a country's human rights record. Broadly supported by Congress, the amendment forced the Soviets to allow for the free immigration of Jews if they wanted most favored nation trading status with the United States. By the 1980s, as other people have mentioned, no summit meeting between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev could take place without President Reagan first presenting a list of Soviet Jews who had been waiting sometimes 2 decades to get out, stuck in limbo, refuseniks as they were known, not allowed to work and yet ostracized and branded parasites by Soviet society. And by 1987, as some of you might know, when Gorbachev made his first visit to the United States, that small protest that had turned into 250,000 people who stood on the mall, including most of the Soviet Jewry leaders, Soviet Jewish leaders like Mr. Sharansky, who by that point had been allowed to leave. The struggle was successful because it was fought at these two different registers. It was a personal, emotional endeavor for American Jews, eager to redeem themselves from their perceived passivity, to erase the stain. But they also knew how to embed this tribal motivation within a much larger frame, to speak in the language of American values of freedom and human dignity, and to believe that they were not only fighting for their own, but also for universal principles of how people everywhere should be treated. And I think this is the central lesson of the movement for human rights struggles today. American Jews were, of course, not unique in their desire to get their countrymen to care about the plight of their brethren. There are Korean Americans who worry that the hunger and oppression of relatives trapped in North Korea is being ignored, Iranian Americans who want a foreign policy that includes more support for dissident groups, Syrian Americans who want U.S. arms to support the resistance to Bashar al-Assad. For these groups and many others trapped by what might seem to some like the parochialism of their individual causes, whether they be ethnic, religious, or national, the Soviet Jewry movement should be an example that the small interests of these groups can be elevated when they voice their concerns in an American tongue, using the language of self-evident freedoms that resonate with all of us. This will often mean negotiating the tension between tribal imperatives and common ones, and finding that overlap. It's not easy or obvious, but that's where the power exists to move public opinion, to move governments, and to amplify a community's concerns until they are shared by as wide a circle as possible. Looking for this overlap also forces activists to present their cases and build grassroots support by appealing to the most elemental human impulse to relate to other people in trouble. One of the great innovations of the Soviet Jewry movement was its ability to personalize and individualize the struggle. My own first contact with the movement was as a 13-year-old, when I was twinned by a Soviet Jewry organization with a young boy from Leningrad whose family had been trying to emigrate for 8 years without success. I was given a brief synopsis of his story, a photograph, and an address. At that point, the movement stopped being large and impersonal, but about my sense of connection with this one young boy. That same spirit of humanizing the struggle extended to all its activism, from the focus on individual prisoners like Mr. Sharansky, to letter writing, wearing bracelets with the names of refuseniks, and for the most committed, actual visits to the Soviet Union to meet the dissidents. From those early days in the 1960s, there was always a sense that the movement was sustained by a grassroots of activists, thousands of people who were willing to volunteer their time and energy for the cause as if their own identities depended on it. This, too, is an important lesson for human rights campaigners. It's not enough to write reports and issue press releases about abuses unless a cause is made concrete, unless it finds a way to animate people, not just intellectually, but also emotionally. It can never move into the realm of actuality. What was so powerful about the Soviet Jewry movement is that it made this leap. It was never just an abstraction. Americans were made to understand, as any successful human rights movement must make people see, that these violations affected all of us in some way. The story of a political prisoner locked up for her beliefs has to be framed as a personal affront to a set of values in order for her cause to ignite others. That's what I saw in those letters from that young boy in Leningrad, a personal affront to my growing sense then of the basic freedoms that any human being should enjoy. It seemed preposterous to me that he and his family couldn't just leave if they wanted to. So creating those small moments of sympathy, I believe, have to be at the heart of any struggle. Then the job of transforming that sentiment into action can begin. No amount of lobbying can be effective before that happens. The intertwining of the particular and the universal. Having examined closely the Soviet Jewry movement, this was the formula that accounts for its success. Its redemptive power for those individuals who made up its activist ranks, combined with the appeal to larger principles that were impossible for Americans to turn away from. It's a formula that I believe still very much has relevance today for those human rights activists frustrated at being ignored and eager to find a way to be heard. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Mr. Smith and then Mr. Lowenthal. I just wanted to say I think you're exactly right. And for all of the different groups, this place is downstream from what is going on out here. This place will, if you think the Congress and the administration will save you, you are mistaken. Unless we have a rare individual like Ronald Reagan who had this in every fiber of him. But Senator Jackson, if you read the book, went out and developed this, and then they beat Washington began to hear. And so I think this is really a model for how we go back and capture and working together, if you will, the gulags in Korea, in North Korea. When this government in North Korea falls, America will feel guilty if it doesn't do something for what's taking place. In Vietnam, we can just go around. But I think I urge those who are interested, just read this book because it sort of lays out a history which I had experienced, but I never sort of quite saw it. So I want to go to Mr. Smith and Mr. Lowenthal. Before I do that, if I can, someone just said there are parents of Sino-Vietnamese prisoners in the audience. If they could just stand up, if they're here, and give me the name of their child. If you can interpret, Doctor, could you interpret? Just so
yes.
they can give us their name
yes.
and their child.
I'm Nguyễn Thị Trâm, the mother of Attorney Lê Quốc Quân. I'm here to ask for help to get my son out of prison.
Any other? Is there no? And we could get both of their names to the staff, so we're able to. And I just urge you ought to just give this cable to the American ambassador in Vietnam. I mean, if this does not move him and the story of this mother, he should be gone, just like that. If it does not, so if you can maybe stay so you can take the names of both of these parents back and in the case. With that, Mr. Smith and then Mr. Lowenthal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I think the witnesses today have just eloquently summed up the plight of dissidents. They spoke about individuals and did so, I think, so passionately. But it is a tip of the iceberg for everyone who we spoke about or they spoke about today. There are thousands of others who are suffering an equal fate of harassment, torture, and gross mistreatment. So it is, the time really has come for a reevaluation at the White House. I would say, with all due respect to the President of the United States, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, it remains unbelievable to me, and I think many others, that in meeting after meeting, he does not publicly speak out on behalf of Liu Xiaobo, Gao Zhejiang, and all the other individuals in China who are being beaten and tortured, as Geng Hu just went through and explained to us afresh, the gross mistreatment, the barbaric mistreatment. People who do those things against innocent and totally idealistic attorneys like Gao Zhejiang, the people who do it and order it are deranged. They're the kind of people, I mean, there's a pathology there that is sickening. We saw it in the Soviet Union, the people who mistreated Natan Sharansky and so many others during the worst days of the Gulag state there. So the ineffective and inadequate attention to political dissidents, again, as the means of reform, if we pay attention to them, the other reforms will follow, and it's not the other way around. Enabling, and that's what we are doing now so callously. Maybe it's done naively, but I would suggest it might even be to the point of being callous. How many times do you have to hear these stories and not change your modus operandi? You know, the Vietnam Human Rights Act, as I think as many of you know, has passed the House. It has passed overwhelmingly. It was totally bipartisan. It is the third time in 3 different Congresses we've been able to get that legislation passed. Okay, thank you. It does provide a roadmap with specific benchmarks for human rights reform, and yet it is languishing right nearby in the Senate, and I will bet, maybe my salary, it will not come up for a vote again in the United States Senate. So to Harry Reid, I make an appeal. Put the bill up to Senator Menendez. Put the bill up for a vote. Its conditionality is so modest, freezing the foreign aid, which is U.S. grant money to the government of Vietnam at the last year's levels, is modest indeed, but it lays out a roadmap for reform. Vietnam, at least the people who are behind Block 8406 and all of the other human rights activists and Dr. Tong, and I would say publicly, who helped us draft that bill. It's an idea whose time has come. So we can talk about human rights, and my good friend and colleague from California, one of the co-sponsors, of course, Mr. Frank Wolf, a co-sponsor. All of us are saying, let's be serious about this. So the Vietnam Human Rights Act, Mrs. Tron, needs to pass. It will help. It'll help daughters, it'll help husbands, wives, and family members. And let me just say, Ms. Grace Gao, as you know so well, who testified on December 5th at a hearing that was focused on the 5 daughters who spoke out to Beijing, but equally spoke out to the White House. I mean, we're the legislative branch. We are not the face of foreign policy. That is an executive branch function, as we all know. We write the laws, we put the money or don't put money into certain accounts, but when it comes to the interface with foreign governments, we can be advocates, and we are, but it is the White House, it is the diplomats who carry the burden or drop that burden for the dissidents, and I would respectfully submit, we wrote a letter to the President of the United States asking that your daughter and the other 4 daughters be allowed to meet with the President to make their case on behalf of their fathers. We haven't even gotten a response back from the White House. That's unconscionable to me. Let me also say that Grace summed up something that I think we often miss, and that is it's not just the prisoner of conscience who suffers so horrifically, but it's all of the circle of family and friends who are in anguish over their daily mistreatment, as you are, and as you have stated so eloquently in the past, as you have done so today. As Grace pointed out, when she would go to school, when you folks were still in China, 6 or 7 policemen would escort her to school, mock her father in the car, make life absolutely miserable for her as well as for the rest of the family. She says, all of my relatives, such as my grandma, grandpa, 3 aunts, and his brother and sisters, are blacklisted. They're deprived of basic rights. And then she goes on, 8 years have passed. The persecution of my father is not only still continuing, but also extends extends to all of our family members. So they're in the gulag too, suffering that anguish. And I think we have to be much more attentive to that than we have been. And she too, she goes, I wish the staffs of the U.S. Embassy in China would at least go and visit my father in prison. Hop in a car and go see him. And if you're rebuffed and turned down, make a big deal about it. It is the indifference, as was mentioned by Robbie George earlier, it is enabling to dictatorships, and we need to speak out much more effectively. Let me just say, too, and it was mentioned by the co-chair earlier, Mr. McGovern, you know, Frank Wolf has been a champion, a leader. The Religious Freedom Act is the law of our land, although it's not being implemented by this administration, but it was written by this man right here. And I have to tell you, the pushback, we were told it would create a hierarchy of human rights by the Assistant Secretary for Democracy and Human Rights, John Shattuck, when he testified before my committee against the Wolf bill. Here's the point person for human rights saying, we don't want the law, we don't want the bill. And thankfully, when it was finally presented with overwhelming bipartisan support in the House and the Senate, because of Mr. Frank Wolf's lead, it was signed by President Clinton, even though he opposed it throughout the entire process. So we're glad to get the signature. But then it has not been effectively implemented. And I think that's why we have to redouble our efforts. We're going to miss you, Frank. I still hope he'll reconsider. He has been a stalwart in combating religious persecution and for speaking out on behalf of prisoners of conscience. Today's hearing is another iteration of that concern and that compassion and that empathy, and we need to redouble our efforts on behalf of all of you and all the others that you speak for today, including in countries that are not here today. We all know which countries they are, and they too will get their place at the witness panel, but we've got to redouble our efforts. And this administration has to stop, however unwittingly that it's doing it, its enabling of dictatorship.
Well, again, thank you, Mr. Chair, Mr. Co-Chair, for holding this hearing, and Congressman Smith for your leadership in especially highlighting the human rights violations in Vietnam. I want to thank all the members of the panel for coming today and to sharing their stories and their advocacy on behalf of prisoners of conscience who are unable to speak for themselves. It is through your voice that we in the Congress can begin to act. It's deeply troubling to hear all of the human rights abuses from all around the world, but I believe it is our opportunity as members of Congress to renew our commitment to shining a spotlight wherever there are prisoners of conscience, wherever they are, and where they're being held without cause and without losing their rights and their individual liberties. I want to especially thank Ms. Tran for her brave testimony. Through the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, I have adopted Mr. Nguyen Tien Trung, who, much like your daughter, has been imprisoned by the Vietnamese government solely for expressing her beliefs. Thank you again for reminding us of the ongoing unacceptable violation of human rights in Vietnam. And for myself, I want to thank you for reminding us that as this Congress addresses the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we should not be rewarding nations that trample on human rights by providing them enhanced privileges. I thank you for bringing that up. It is something that we must continue to address, and I appreciate all of you for being here. Thank you.
So we're going to end with showing a film. Where is the film going to? There's going to be a film. It's a very short. I think it's a 5-minute film.
Я Марина Адамович, жінка Миколи Статкевича, былого кандидата у президенти Білорусі, який був арештований 19 снежня 2010 года, у дзень выбораў, асуджана до 6 гадоў калоніі ўзмоцненага рэжыму. Для нас вельмі важная міжнародная солідарнасць, яна вельмі важная для нас, для сваякоў, бо дазваляе нам не адчуваць себе пакінутымі. Яна вельмі важная для наших хлопцаў, таму што не дазваляе рэжыму проста расправіцца з імі, калі да іх прыцягнута ўвага. І мы вельмі удзячныя за цвёрдую пазіцыю і вельмі просім, каб цвёрдая пазіцыя Злучаных Штатаў працягвала заставацца такой жа цвёрдай. Мы просім вас прыняць усе мажлівыя меры міжнароднага ўплыву на беларускі рэжым дзеля таго, каб не толькі нашы блізкія былі на волі, але і краіна была вольнай. І перш за ўсё, канешне, рэч ідзе аб санкцыях, перш за ўсё эканамічных, якіх рэжым вельмі баіцца.
With that, we will, Grant, I want to thank all of the
እስክንድር ጋር በቃ ከመጨረሻዋ ቀን ስንብት በኋላ ተገናኘችም አላውቅም፣ ታየችም አላውቅም፣ መንገዱም የለም። ለእስክንድር ነው መልእክት ማስተላለፈው። አንተ ብታልፍም ራእይህ አያልፍም፣ ለህዝብ ለሀገር ኢትዮጵያ ውስጥ ዲሞክራሲ ሀሳብን በነጻነት የመግለጽ መብት እንዲከበር ነው መስዋዕት የሆንከው። መስዋዕትነትህ ዋጋ አለው፣ መስዋዕትነትህ ዋጋ አለው። በርታ ነው የምለው። በቃ እንግዲህ እስክንድር ሲታሰር የመጀመሪያው አይደለም። የገባበትን ምክንያት ያው እስክንድር ማንም እንደሚያውቀው ጸሐፊ ነው፣ ጋዜጠኛ ነው። በየጊዜው መንግስትን ይተቻል። ሌላ ምንም ምክንያት የለም። የተከሰሰበት ግን ከሱ ጋር የማይወክለው ከስሙ ጋር የማይሄድ አሸባሪ ተብሎ ነው። እስክንድር ጋዜጠኛ ነው፣ አሸባሪ አይደለም። ምንም ነገር ማለፍም አይችል፣ ነገ እታሰራለሁ፣ ነገ ሌላ ነገር ይደርስብኛል ብሎ ዛሬን ከመጻፍ ወደ ኋላ ማይል አላመጣም። ነገ ውጤት አላመጣም አይደለም፣ ውጤት ያመጣል። በርቱ፣ ጠንክሩ። ኢትዮጵያ ላይ ያላችሁ ትኩረት አሁንም ይቀጥል ነው የምለው። ሌሎችም የታሰሩ እንደ እስክንድር አይነት ሌሎችም ጋዜጠኞች ላይ የምታረጉትን ነገር ይቀጥል። ጥረታችን ውጤት አላመጣም አትበሉ፣ ተስፋ አትቁረጡ፣ ውጤት ያመጣል። በርቱ ነው የምለው።
Kính thưa quý vị, tôi là Võ Văn Bửu, chồng của tù nhân lương tâm Mai Thị Dung, hiện đang bị giam tại thủ đô Hà Nội, Việt Nam, cách nhà tôi 2.000 cây số. Vợ tôi đang mang các chứng bệnh hiểm nghèo mà không được đưa đi chữa trị hơn 7 năm nay. Lần thăm cách đây 2 tuần, vợ tôi đi không nổi, phải nhờ người dìu. Vợ tôi tay chân bị sưng, phù, tóc rụng gần hết. Vợ tôi bị giam giữ về đối xử dã man vô nhân đạo, chỉ vì đấu tranh đòi quyền tự do trên tôn giáo, giáo Hòa Hảo mà bị xử tù 11 năm vì tội gây rối trật tự công cộng. Rất mong quý vị hãy cứu giúp vợ tôi, nếu không vợ tôi sẽ phải bị chết trong tù. Xin chân thành cảm ơn.
Thank you, Chairman Wolf, Chairman McGovern, and other members of the Commission for allowing me to speak on behalf of my son, as well as Lê Quốc Quân and Đinh Nguyên Kha, whose mothers are sitting right here next to me. We are here because our sons remained in prison in Vietnam. We asked for your intervention because our son did nothing wrong other than exercising the freedom of speech. Yet, my son, Trần Quỳnh Duy Thích, was sentenced to 16 years in prison and 5 years under house arrest. His trial lasted less than 1 day. We therefore appeal to the Commission to request the Vietnamese government to allow you to visit our sons and other prisoners of conscience in Vietnam. If your request is denied, please make it a condition upon the signing of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. As a member of the Vietnam Path Movement, one of many civil society organizations set up recently in Vietnam, I urge you to help us with the capacity building, training, so that our people will be empowered to advocate for changes and for the release of all prisoners of conscience in Vietnam. Thank you very much for your attention to this matter.
İnsan hakkı müdafiəçi, Toluş Sadıq qəzet baş redaktor, fizika riyaziyyat elmlər namizədi Hilal Mammadov, Ostoro rayonunda Toluş folklor tədbiri davordini, yanaşa in tədbiri video YouTube'da noy bapış, çayka qısıl saygora, 6 sor türmədən iştakası ərizə əsasən və təqib yəm təzyiqə məruz bə. Aşağı qatıqura polis, visti iyum, dıhazı donzamya sorada, başay cif, yəm mənzir narkotika şodoşu, soxta protokol tərdif kardeşi və narkotika havoti iddiamış doy. Dımına kifayətlənmiş nübün daruş bapışda, və həmin türmədən iştakası ərizəsindən əlavə dıqla soxdu və davləti xəyanət, milli, jovijniyyəti eğandı qona iddiamış dolaşını. Məhkəmə real vəziyyəti ictimaiyyəti ki, New York'a qora məqsədi şəkildə qapalı və hilalı pensor koduşu. Məlum ki, narkotika, yəni şpiyonəti bəyandı tamamilə ziddi, deyətə basa dünya tarixədə jago qıla şey təsadüf bəni ki, şpiyon həmən də narkotika məşğul oldu. Hələm dünya kriminallığı tarixədə jagna şey bəni. Onun tamam absurdu ama hüquq müdafiə təşkilatının, yəni ABŞ Davlət Departamenti Hilali Azərbaycanı yardım kartı qura xahiş qardamın. Başıma həməni deyələ hörməti Hilal Məmmədov ailənumi ki, Səbadi Məmmədov.
Everyone on the videos were adopted by members and are part of the Defending Freedom project. Secondly, Mr. Smith and Dr. Tong wanted me to announce that they're going to have a press conference at 1:45 in Rayburn 2255, whereby they will release a report on torture in Vietnam. And with that, let me just thank everybody. I think it was one of the better hearings that I've attended since I've been here. And I want to thank the witnesses for coming so far. And I think we can commit that all the members of the committee will work on these. And I think we will adopt a project, which was a great idea from Mr. Sharansky, of picking 3 or 4 or 5 places that we can name the streets in front of the embassies and see what we can do to sort of move that process. Again, hearing adjourned. Thank you.